Good day, everybody. Welcome to today's event. As you all know, I'm just going to give a few introductory words. This is part of the Acquire Summit, which is now a series of events that we've organized. Starting with the ice hockey last Sunday, feels like 2 weeks ago. There's been so much going on. An intense one-day conference on Monday at another convene venue, and a super classic car club event on Tuesday afternoon. Amazing dinner in Gramercy Tavern. If you haven't been there, I'd very much recommend it. We took Wednesday off to catch up on emails, and here we are Thursday for a really exciting workshop by Dan and Jake. And so it's been a great fun organizing a series of events, all sort of linked to e-commerce, building the community of mainly buyers, but also thought leaders, experts, and a few of our clients learning how to pitch their exits and observe how acquirers work. All of the recordings from today and the conference back on Monday will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. So we'll send you all links to that, some super talks from everyone from big PE firms to experts on the creator economy. So for today, I'd really like to thank Eric from Stanvast for sponsoring today's event. These convene venues are not cheap. Monday and today are not cheap, but they are the best we can find in terms of AV and facilities. So it's great to host the events in these types of places. Big thank you to Jake and Dan, who are going to walk us through the show. Jake, at the dinner on Tuesday, says every Harvard lecture he gives is like putting on a show. So we look forward to a show today. For all the online attendees, it would be really cool if you could turn on your cameras, just so we can feel like you're in the room. So please don't be shy. The two Joes, Joseph Falcao, Joseph Rizico, Ben, David, Jenny, please turn on your cameras. Lauren Truck up in Canada. Please turn on your cameras. It would be really good instead of hiding behind the face. Final thing from me before I hand over to the guys. My son and I are flying out at 9 o'clock, so we're gonna have to jump ship at about 5. So I hope you really enjoy the whole day and get drinks afterwards. And my colleague Paul, the co-founders of the Fortia Group, will be here, and he'll continue the festivities. And we look forward to doing something similar in New York this time next year, another series of interesting events. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dan and Jake.
So I think I'm gonna have a mic. Can you all hear me okay? Is that coming in? Perfect. Okay, excellent. Hi, I'm Jake. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Tadpull. And also, I have been a professor at Harvard Business School for about 4 years. I created and teach a course called the Digital Marketing Workshop. And my job is to get tightly wound type A MBAs comfortable with probability and failing and messing around with these tools and things like that, which is a hard thing sometimes for them to learn. So I'm going to be joined with my colleague, Dan. I'll let you introduce yourself, Dan, real quick.
Hello. Good to be with you. Dan McCarthy, kind of wear 2 hats. One is as a professor. I'm at the University of Maryland, College Park. I teach customer lifetime valuation, how you can predict what customers will do, and then what that means for companies. I'm also a 3-time co-founder. So I'd started a company called Zodiac, predictive analytics software as a service firm. We did customer lifetime value on behalf of marketing departments to help them make tactical customer acquisition retention decisions. We grew it, sold it to Nike in March of 2018. We were able to work into our non-compete that we could essentially use the same models, but for a investment diligence use case. So since then, we've been running Theta. Theta does customer lifetime value. At the start, it was purely on behalf of private equity firms. Now it's about 50-50 private equity and corporate. So live and breathe kind of predictive models and how you can use them to both help understand, how good a company is as an investment prospect, their ability to grow in profitability. Also, if you're on the company side, how you can kind of best communicate the value that you've created through all the good stuff that your customers are doing. So excited for it.
Excellent. Okay, so I think before we get started, what I'd love to do is ask anybody in the audience that has, or online, has any sort of like burning questions while we do some quick AV here. Is there any really important questions like, hey, before I leave here, I'd really like to know this. I would encourage you to don't be afraid. You're among friends here. Ask the questions you're afraid to ask. I've heard them all, by the way, trust me, even at Harvard MBA. So don't be shy if you have any questions. Those online as well too. So anybody have one? Please.
Yeah, I'd like to find out how the calculation actually works and how I could apply ideally for our own set of customers.
Lifetime value calculations?
Of course, we do have one.
Sure.
But
Sure. Okay. You have one of the world's leading experts on this to my right, so you're in good shape. So,
My class is literally called Customer Lifetime Valuation.
right. There's some fantastic stuff here as well. Excellent question. Very important one too, especially when you look at paid ads. Other questions people have? Yes.
Insights between any insights, I suppose, in measuring brand performance between attribution models and incrementality.
Oh, attribution models. Yes. I don't know if you saw yesterday, Google announced Meridian, which is kind of their new open source model for doing media mix modeling. Brand new, which ingests keyword data in addition to YouTube signals as well. So attribution, we've got an example when we get into campaigns, talking about media mix modeling or marketing mix modeling, how you kind of think about that. Also talk about what you can't measure with attribution and what's possible there too. So excellent. Fantastic. Any other questions? Yes.
Any insight on AMC? It's the Amazon data tool. Looking at a lot of this, if you guys have any or any other Amazon specific lifetime value info, as Amazon is their data can be weird at times.
Yes.
It's a good question. Especially integrating it with, if you have your own website and you're selling to it, how you can kind of connect the dots across the two.
Yeah.
So kind of a D to Z, Amazon, and what's possible, what Uncle Jeff won't give you for data, or what he will. So excellent question. Yes, fantastic. Other questions? Yes, Emmett.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Of course.
Thank you.
The more the better.
The sort of the benefits of recurring revenue when you think
Ooh,
about
yes.
customer lifetime
Holy
value.
grail, yes. We've had 2 exits in our portfolio. We'll talk about recurring revenue. Yes. There's some very specific ways on how you can calculate that too. About recurring revenue, like how to figure out customer cohorts that do recurring revenue, how to get purchases through campaigns, or just recurring revenue in general.
I come at it from a valuation perspective,
Sure.
M&A perspective. Yeah, so trying to link it back to that in terms of company valuation.
Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about cohorts or groups of customers. Then we also kind of like to think by campaigns. I can share a little bit what we've seen on valuations driving when a lot of that repeat customers come through an own channel like email or SMS or direct mail versus running an ad on a customer that you already have. So we'll get into some nuance on that. Excellent questions. Anything else?
It's maybe outside of scope, but
Fire away, Ari.
any tools out there that help optimize across channels?
Yes. Cross channel. And you're talking about paid, owned, email, SMS, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, basically ingesting data to tell you spend more here.
Yes, this will tie into this piece of MMM. I got an example which will show you that, which is pretty interesting too. Not perfect, but yeah. How do you think about cross-channel tools? I've got some data that's pretty interesting on how few people are doing this too. Excellent. Other questions? Any online, Eric? Is there anything coming online?
I do appreciate maybe you can say something where
Sure.
Q&A issues.
Okay, no sweat.
Yeah, so we do have some more coming in. I think one was just generally maybe Nico mentioned it, but how does email capture sort of factor into a quantified LTV?
Ooh, yes. Okay, so we can capture email with LTV. This is what we're going to call zero-party data, which is a really horrible word or phrase, but basically how you build customer data off in your digital experiences that you can then kind of use as seed data to figure out all sorts of interesting things. So we have some examples of that too. Likes, preferences, why would they give you their phone number? Everyone does a discount. What else you can do to capture that too? Anything else? Perfect. Okay. We love doing these smaller group workshops because it makes it a little bit more intimate, a little more comfortable. Our hope is when you walk out of here later this afternoon, you got a couple like big ideas on not only where the world is going perhaps, but also some things like your port codes, or if you're looking at buying PE driven type e-com businesses or omni-channel commerce, you have some good like things to watch out for. So as we go, hopefully we'll get through all these. If not, or some come, please make sure you raise your hand. We'll continue to capture these as we go through it. All right. Okay, so everything here is a custom GPT. You can scan this QR code. This is all my lecture notes, all the cases I write for class from Harvard are here. It's a live ask any question. So the stuff you don't want to put on the board, you can ask the GPT. It's kind of like my office hours tool I use at class, so help yourself to that. We've got another one I built just special for you here in a little bit that'll have some actual live customer data, so we can play with that too if you haven't messed around with like a custom GPT. So let me know. It'll also throw, depending if you're logged into GPT, I've had it throw problems if you're in OpenAI's tools. So you may have to log in and log back out, but it should be there, hopefully. And we'll have the deck and that we can share as well afterwards too. Perfect. Cool. Okay, so really quick, we're gonna go through this kind of this 3C flywheel, these customers, campaigns, and catalog. I'll give you an overview on that. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Dan, who's going to go through this kind of gold mine of data as well. And then we'll get into campaigns, the catalog or the product, the doom loops that can happen when you run out of stock. Some cautionary tales there of slashing inventory or having the wrong mix there. And then we're going to play with some AI along the way as well. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say Dr. Fader had a family emergency and couldn't join us. Sends his regards.
I will channel my inner Pete Fader.
Yeah, Dan will channel inner Pete Fader as we go through this as well. Okay. Let's just start where we're at, right? So I think we've seen some, I think the conference on Monday mentioned a little bit around some of these maybe doldrums of e-commerce, where we're at. I think it's important to remember we're still very much in the early innings. This is some data from the feds, kind of looking at e-commerce going back as a percent of retail sales. We see the gray bars are kind of recession. So we had obviously the huge spike in COVID, and then it's kind of coming back. So if we kind of extrapolate that line, it is compounding. The last 2 or 3 quarters, we're seeing 4 to 6% compound annual growth rate in commerce. What's interesting is when we think about B2B, we're still very much in any 1 or 2 in B2B e-commerce as well. So massive opportunities we see on that, and a lot of very low-hanging fruit in terms of how you can make those properties perform. Let's talk about Shopify. It's pretty interesting data coming out from Shopify. They're approaching 35% of Amazon's GMV and $270 billion, which is pretty wild. And so this kind of begs the question, when anybody can build a store these days, technology really isn't a moat. So we're going to wrestle this afternoon with some ideas of what do you do when your competitors can build a store as well, and the infrastructure is getting built out on that. Another trend, this just came out yesterday. It's a study with Google and Boston Consulting Group. Basically, only 20% of people have deeply integrated AI into their marketing workflows. But of those, 60% revenue growth compared to their peers. And I think the biggest thing here is they're adapting to consumer trends twice as fast. So if you're seeing things like, for example, one of our clients in the B2B space said, we don't need to worry about perplexity or large language models. People aren't really changing their search behavior. They're going to Google to find it. From capturing data on site, and this is in the kind of arbor care space, we're already seeing like that month over month is growing like anywhere between 10 to 20% on those. So having data on your customers allows you to predict trends twice as fast, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so the other thing, real quick, who here, everybody here, I guess, is playing with ChatGPT, right, in this room? And Claude, I think DeepSeek as of, 48 hours, maybe 72 hours now? So kind of a wild west. There's this kind of question now is like everything basically a large language wrapper. And so what you're seeing is everybody saying, oh, we're an AI company now. We're using AI. We're putting AI in everything, right? And I think this is kind of akin to what we saw maybe 15 or 20 years ago, where we're now going to be cloud first. We're going to be in the cloud. We're using the cloud, all this type of stuff. What I'd encourage you to think about is we're a data company now. You're going to basically, for a lot of these things, start to take an LLM off the shelf, pick which one may fit, or even blend them together, and then run that on top of data that you have that your competitors don't, or Amazon can't get to, or anything like that that's available, or even merging different data sets together on that.
If you had a question.
No, I was just going to say that they used to call everything internet companies.
Yeah, internet. Yeah, we talked about this the other night dinner, right? There's internet companies, and we're all this thing. And so I think what's interesting too is like, nobody would, in their right mind, build a server on premise to like run their e-commerce store, right? You're going to rent this infrastructure. There's a case being made that you might even rent the LLM down the road too. So if you have all this data, why doesn't people make a lot of money? This is a couple of our colleagues, Ron Berman at Wharton and Ayala Israeli at Harvard, did this study. They looked at 1,500 e-commerce sites. And the one thing they noticed was if the teams would look at the data, a descriptive dashboard once a week, they would go 4 to 10%. So all these amazing predictive insights and all this AI, a lot of this took us to the human in the loop of going back and just looking at the data on that side of it. So that's a lot of what we spend our time at Tadpull thinking about is how do you build these experiences to not only collect data that competitors can't get their hands on, and then how do you get teams to action on it and look at it as well. So when you're a data company, you want to think about these kind of 3 key data sets: customers, campaigns, and catalog. And this kind of sets us up for the afternoon. So customers have all sorts of great data. We've got a GPT you're going to play with that's probably somewhat pieces of it are laying around in your businesses right now. Transaction logs, and Dan will go much deeper on this, what you can do with just good old boring customer ID, purchase date, order amount. You can do some amazing stuff with that. We're also getting some other types of data. Like, is everybody familiar with like what a pixel is? A tracking pixel on a website? So pixel data, which is getting harder and harder to get signals from as privacy gets clamped down by Apple or Google. So what do you do in this kind of declining world of pixel data? Our software builds pixel data. We see that. One of the biggest things we see in our data sets is year over year, how many of these sites the tracking is getting blocked. That in itself is really powerful for thinking about paid media spends, retargeting, and all that as well. The zero-party data, which I feel is a really huge opportunity where you're capturing quizzes or preferences, all that comments, that's a gold mine that you can start to, again, train an LLM across. And then we feed that into our campaigns for either owned media like email and SMS or running ads. And then the last piece that a lot of people don't want to talk about in marketing is inventory, the stuff that keeps the CFO, COO up at night. We overbought on this, we're under stock on that. We went out of stock, and now we're tanking on Amazon as a result, or our SEO is tanking. So how do you think about the product catalog and finding kind of the right product for the right customer, and then you start to use AI to do it at the right time. From that, we're going to use, pick your LLM for cost and use, whatever you want, roll your own. And then the automation and action. So building this culture of kind of humans in the loop, which again, where all these things tend to fail is that the humans aren't always using some of the data as well. But if they can, there's that 4 to 10% growth as well. Perfect. Okay. So what? Well, we're going to try and predict something very simple that every PE investor that we talk to wants to understand: revenue. My marketing team can't hit a goal. I tell them I want this growth. I don't know what it looks like. We're going to show you a really quick tool here that you can use to predict revenue. So this is your boring old data that's probably lying around. As we say, this is kind of the gold in the couch cushions. Good old-fashioned daily sales data. So if you have an aggregate of how many sales by day and you have 2 to 3 years of data, we can directionally start to predict what will happen with our revenue. So this is an example of a site here, very big site, doing probably, I think they're coming in around 130 million. And you're seeing, does everybody know what these spikes are? Black Friday, Cyber Monday, right? So here's these spikes, right? So we're training the model to try and fit this blue line through these as best we can. And then we can kind of see here, there's a little bit of a variance where the lighter blue kind of shows maybe a confidence interval. So again, it's not a crystal ball, but it is directional. And we can kind of see that, wow, it's not really growing that much over the next couple of years, right? This in itself is like a really, really important signal because you're starting to think that, wow, we might have some issues here going forward that we need to be absolutely thinking about here because Black Friday, Cyber Monday aren't spiking like they used to. And these confidence intervals kind of fan out over time as well. Now, this isn't perfect. Does anybody remember? Yeah.
Is that your tool? Is that a shop?
This is our tool. And what's interesting, though, is do you remember Zillow during the pandemic? What happened? Do you remember what happened when they bought a bunch of houses? So do you remember the story of Zillow? Yeah, so Zillow had this machine learning algorithm. Like you guys remember that Zillow was like buying houses, right? So they had this machine learning algorithm to like go out and buy these houses. And people were figuring out they could buy it and then hold it and then flip it and sell it back to Zillow in like 6 months and make like 100 grand, right? And what happened was a lot of this time series data it's trained because this is very kind of sinusoidal. It's kind of got a somewhat of a signal that's kind of got a rhythm to it. Well, the algorithm had never seen that. And so they kind of let it go crazy and just keep buying on autopilot. And then they woke up to the fact that there's never been a global pandemic where people could relocate. So there's a cautionary tale there a little bit on don't just blindly trust the algorithm. You do need that kind of human in the loop.
But does that algorithm take into account like external factors as well? Or is that just their internal?
It does a time series prediction, so a date timestamp as well.
Does that really make sense if you have all these external factors like competition and because I think competition will impact that significantly, right?
Definitely. And see, these kind of fit pretty well. But maybe if it went up and then down and up, and it was like, but this has a really nice rhythm to it. Now, if you looked at a macro trend like ad spend, inflation, all those types of things. You can start to build those variables into the model to see. So I think sometimes those can be helpful. A lot of times you get to the end of it, it doesn't really tell you, you can kind of flip a quarter at the end of it. What it will start to tell you, though, is how much should you plan your marketing calendar off of. So in this model, we start to see some different impacts of holiday as well, which is helpful. And then this is where it gets to be kind of interesting. So we can get some clues, again, not perfect, but some clues that, wow, the model's saying lower predictive estimates in March, weekends, sales weekends. And the data will tell us what happened. It doesn't always tell us why. So that's a huge thing. To your point, we have competition, some of the things we don't know, if someone undercut us on price. That won't necessarily show up, but you can start to see weekend sales. And then we start to see that, wow, on Tuesday, we're down 12% from the average. Sundays exceed this, right? Ask any marketing team if they'll send emails on Sunday, and they'll tell you, no, don't waste your time. No one's on their phone on Sunday. Turns out we've seen oftentimes as people watching football or sports, they'll buy a lot of stuff. A couple beers in them by 4 o'clock, they're ready to buy. So that can be a really interesting clue off that data, on that daily sales data as well, to kind of flight either your ad spend or your own media pushes on that. And again, all we do is take boring daily sales data to kind of unpack that as well. Okay. I'm going to show you this, what we call the golden equation of digital marketing. I'm going to turn over to Dan, and we're going to decompose this into a couple different pieces. So basically, all in digital marketing we've got, for those of you that maybe played with this stuff a little bit, there's kind of lots of different ways we get sessions to a website. Then we're multiplied by conversion rate. They bought something, they signed up for something, and then when we think about the value of that, the order total, a marketing qualified lead, that generates your revenue. Pretty straightforward equation, nothing too fancy or complicated with that. And now a lot of times, and this is on the board already, is maybe they came in from TikTok, they saw an ad, they got free shipping through the email. How much is that TikTok first touch worth? This is where we start to get into some statistical stuff with testing it, and then we have to do holdouts, and it's a little bit more hands-on, but we can start to figure out what's that kind of Venn diagram, knowing that Venn diagram might change in 6 months as well. So that's all you have to think about. If you, by the way, go to any meeting or evaluate any business in digital or e-com, you can go a long, long ways with this equation back in the envelope. It'll tell you a lot. So if you think about this and we go a little bit deeper, this is how we could kind of break it down. So you can look at sessions, conversion rate, average order value will give you kind of your revenue per month. And then you can start to see how these things might come through. Won't go too nerdy on like attribution and what got the click for the win or multi-touch attribution, some of these different things. But this is kind of a handy way to back of the envelope think about top line revenue. So if we had to grow a business, most people focus on growing sessions. Let's get more traffic to the site or app. That's the answer, right? We just need more eyeballs. And you can run more ads, you can boost your traffic, you can do your conversion rate by 25%. I think Stanvest has some really interesting data around this, where just changing 2-day shipping can make huge impacts on conversion rates, right, at checkout. So little tiny tweaks like that. A lot of people get obsessed in this. They don't think about this piece, the conversion rate, making our site load quicker on mobile. Amazon takes care for this, obviously all this for you on the back side of that. But if you're doing D2C, there's a huge opportunity there. AOV, in my experience, average order value is pretty hard to move. People kind of lock in. Whatever that is, it kind of reaches an asymptote and tends to be pretty solid. You can try bundling, new product introductions, things like that. Shopify makes this pretty easy with plugins, but that tends to be one of the harder ones to kind of move by 25%. But if you can kind of stack them all together, you can get a nice lift in revenue and almost double the business, kind of getting them all together. So it's kind of like conducting an orchestra to get all these pieces moving as well. So if you're looking at these companies, if you're thinking about them in due diligence or in value creation, don't let them obsess on this. I spend a lot of time on here, and then think about creative ways to introduce products or the catalog here to drive average order value. Okay, this is a quick example from our software. How do you auction on this? Put humans in the loop. We basically grab the stupid simple use of AI on that tracking, and then showing teams, again, 4 to 10% growth, just looking at the data. We can alert on these things as well, just off the Shopify data. And now teams are tracking on this. So if we start to dip and we're off, we're below target, we know we have to take action on something. And then we'll go to the sessions, we'll think about conversions, and work it backwards from there. We've seen teams be behind quite a bit. One of our companies, this is publicly released, is owned by Kathmandu Brands. We were really having a hard time headed into the fourth quarter, like way off forecast. And from this daily data and looking and tracking this, we were able to make up ground and exceed and set record for Q4, purely because we had this kind of clues to goals to look at on a daily basis as well. Okay, so all we're going to think about here really quick, we're going to put some capital into business. We're going to go after our customers. We're going to get better campaigns. We're going to move our product catalog. And then that should throw off some cash, hopefully, increase the valuation, or with free cash flows, we can kind of go rinse and repeat and take it to the next level as well. There's big shifts that happen between kind of a phase 1 and a phase 2. As we're telling everybody, think of yourself as a data company now. Drive your portcos to think of themselves as data companies now, because if you can't make that shift and you do have to sell it or write it off, knowing that as soon as possible is really, really valuable. Okay, so these don't happen overnight though. This is one of our clients we worked with for 9 years to build the Flywheel. They were recently acquired by Yeti. When we started, e-com was a very tiny part of the business. A lot of it was actually B2B, surprisingly. And then over time, we were able to get that kind of north of 30% as well. But the customer data, just simple things when they sign up for an email, what types of products are you interested in? We had these kind of tiny lists, but my God, would they perform? So the quantity and the quality could work really, really, really well on that side of it too. And then knowing, these are really nice backpacks. So maybe you buy an $800 backpack to go hike the Appalachian Trail, but you might also buy a book bag down the road in 6 months. And the AI and some of the work that Dan and Pete have developed can help drive some clues on when that customer is ready to purchase again. And when we have enough data, we can predict what that next product is that they should buy as well. Okay, should we play with a little AI real quick? Do you want to do that? Okay, perfect. Okay, caveat. This will hallucinate. It's going to do weird, quirky things, okay? We're going to play with this the rest of the afternoon. So just plan on that. When we did this live in class, we had to do some really funny things. So the human in the loop piece of it. But you can either scan this QR code, this is the bit.ly link as well, and we will play with some stuff. Okay, is everybody seeing, I can go back. Does everybody have that pulled up? Perfect. It's in the chat too for anybody online. Okay, so really quick, this is a mini case series I wrote for Harvard Business School around the scenario of should you sell on Amazon, should you do something in the middle or go pure D2C? And the case is set up with this protagonist, her name is Shivani, and she's trying to figure out how does she sell a CEO or CFO on building some of this data. And the CFO has not seen growth in e-com, their site's terrible, it doesn't load on mobile, but the CEO is convinced they are not a tech data company. And so as I was going through and writing this, I was like, it'd be really fun if the students could kind of see on the other side of this in a fictitious way if they'd actually built this tool and had this kind of data and what they could access. So fast forward, this is the custom GPT. We're going to play with it as well. I'm going to show you how to do some prompting in a little bit. There's some prompting fundamentals. Maybe you all know how to do this, but I found my students tend to treat GPT like Google. And there's a real art and a science to how you write these prompts to get better insights. So we're going to start doing it, Wild West, and we'll see what we do. So I would say, yes. Sure, no problem. Yeah. No problem. Did that pull up? You bet. So our goal is who can get the craziest hallucination and why they think it's a hallucination here, okay, all right? So we'll start with asking it some very basic questions that are kind of pre-built. Now, before we get started, I'll show you a little bit. Actually, I won't. We'll just make it be kind of fun here. We'll start with a very general question here. So basically what it's going to do is going to go through and see. All right, so it's giving us some basic stuff here. Customer segmentation, retention, lifetime value, acquisition. Okay, it's going to keep going here. For those of you that have seen a little code, what it's doing is it's basically loading all this, and now it's going to start to show me, it's going to run some Python, and you can see it live in the browser, basically analyzing the data with Python and code, which is kind of cool here as well. And now it's going to go through here, business areas it's going to categorize as well on this. And now it's doing an RFM segmentation, which, by the way, these LLMs are roll the dice. They run on a probability, so you don't always know what it's going to do. I didn't pre-plan this, so Dan can talk about RFM segmentation if we want. But it's literally writing all sorts of interesting things off of what it just saw in the data. So what it has is customer date, they placed an order, how much they ordered, how much time they spent on the website from, say, Google or Facebook, if they made a second purchase, what the date was and the amount, if they left a net promoter score. We also have what industry they're from, and a huge shout out to my friend Chris at Duke, who helped me work on this week as well, who's using it in her course in the exec ed. So she had some great ideas here, so I'd be remiss if I didn't give her credit. So we looked at industry, zip codes, all this kind of stuff. So imagine you have all this really good, clean, unified data around individual customers and how they're buying on the site. So now it's just coming back, right? Chugging, chugging, chugging. And we could let it keep going. All right, so while it's plugging away, let's let you all play with it and ask it a question and see if you could ask something very basic and see what we get to come back. And there's no wrong answers here.
You know what I'm asking it.
All right. Did you get it to hallucinate yet?
Probably.
Yeah.
Although I don't know if it's hallucination or if it's just ignorance.
Yeah, it could be both.
I asked it how's lifetime value been trending across acquisition cohorts?
Oh,
Now, I assume
excellent.
you don't have contribution profit data?
No.
or-
Yeah. Yep, exactly.
It's all revenue based, which
Yes.
right there, you're going to run into some problems.
Yes.
But it will give you an answer.
It will give you an answer. Which is a good segue as Dan gets going here on customer data. Additional data sets you'll need that this data set is kind of by design missing on purpose as well. Yes.
So how's the data being collected?
Excellent. So what it's done is this is a synthetic data set, meaning I just had ChatGPT make it up for me.
I mentioned like Pixel with iOS 14 from them, it's not really working, right? So we have different data sets or
Yeah, so this is basically a sketch of what our software builds on an individual customer data set level as well. So we have pixel data, we have internet net promoter score, comments, all that kind of stuff as well. To Dan's point, one of the hardest things we see, especially in kind of mid-market or lower mid-market, is getting SKU data, profit data from the ERP system into Shopify that we can grab it through the API and pull that in. Yes. Yeah, so we have Shopify data, we have ERP data, we might grab data from like an ad platform, all that as much as possible to kind of build this whole constellation around the customer as well. But it's a good point. A lot of times margin data shockingly is missing, especially if you have large SKU counts. So it'd be shocked how many times if you have 50,000 to 100,000 SKU counts, 20% might be missing the margin data for lots of reasons.
Yeah, so usually there's kind of some workarounds, but I'd say iOS 14, the big issue is that it makes it harder to get what the actual source was of the transaction, but usually the transaction log itself should be unaffected. Yeah, it's just kind of knowing where those purchases had come from, that they kind of severed that link to be able to identify that as well.
what really had us in our case is like also relying on post-purchase service, like
Yeah.
happening accommodates what the
Yeah, and there's kind of ways to stitch it together with, post-purchase, I think are interesting pieces. Sometimes people say, I remember I saw you on TikTok when they really saw you someplace else. So what they say they saw and what they can recall can be different. But again, all this stuff can be directionally something to go test against to see for sure. How about this group in the back? Any good hallucinations anybody has or any like goofy answers? Perfect. As I tell my students, think of this as the drunk summer intern. Like it's really eager, it's kind of drunk, it'll tell you what you want. And so you got to kind of act and like manage it carefully to see what's possible. We'll go look at a little bit more on the actual like raw data that it's pulling from the CSV in a little bit here so you can see that. But just as a first pass, I think it's interesting to see.
The way that this was defining lifetime value was historical revenue per customer. So there's actually not a predictive aspect to it.
Yes,
There's, in addition to the lack of cost data.
yes. Which is gonna be a perfect segue. I'm gonna turn over to Dan and he'll be able to go much, much deeper on what you would think about. But at least you can start to see what customer data is possible. One thing we're doing at HBS is there's a course called Data Science for Managers, a mandatory course the first year students take. And not surprisingly, students didn't really like the coding aspect. They didn't really like R. And so this year we're using Julius AI, which is more of a chat with your data type of deal as well, where you can upload the data. So again, I feel like my perspective is the data is where the good, clean data is where it's at. You're going to basically have these interfaces, these wrappers around it as well. So the real value is in building the data sets. And then knowing like what questions to ask of the data, that's where the human in the loop or the expertise becomes really helpful. To Dan's point, there's holes in this data by design. that are not giving you as much data, but it's telling you that it's very, very accurate. And you can start to believe the drunk intern telling you what you want to hear on it. So I think on that note, we'll come back and we'll play this a little bit. I've got a couple of things. I'll show you how to do some prompting. We'll have it do some Instagram ad creation here in a little bit off this data. I'll show you some examples of what my students did as well. But I think that's a good way to maybe turn it over to Dan, and we'll let you kind of walk through the customer components here as well.
Sounds great. Yeah, I will share my screen. Let's see here. All right. Hopefully this comes through for the people who are attending virtually as well. So maybe just to show of hands, so first, how many people here kind of work on behalf of or for companies? And then how many, well, I should say corporations as opposed to like buy side or sell side firms. And how many people here are on the buy side? And how about the sell side? No. So yes, I think I asked that because I'd say this can be useful, but it can be useful in different ways depending on which side of the aisle you're on. You know, if you're on the buy side, what you want to understand is you've got some company, is it valuable or not? You know, if it's growing very quickly, but they're still losing money, are they going to be able to grow their way into profitability soon? Is it going to take a long time? Or, you know, is it kind of a pipe dream? On the sell side, oftentimes when we've kind of worked with the sell side, it's really to best communicate the value that's inherent in a particular company that they're trying to do a transaction for. And the two things that you want to make sure to do are, one, convey the best possible, you know, message about the business, but then also to avoid disclosing things that could actually backfire and make your company look a lot worse to potential investors. And then for the companies themselves, there's really kind of two use cases. The one is, you know, kind of like the sell side, that if you're, you know, looking to kind of raise the next round, you want to be able to communicate that value to potential prospective investors. And if you're not profitable, oftentimes it can create more incentive to show that you have the potential to be profitable in the future. And the second use case is really on the kind of the customer management side, you know, that you have budget, you're trying to allocate it. You know, some of the questions that we're seeing over here, where should I be allocating my marketing dollars? And so I think this topic, it really has something for all those different audiences. The way I've been coming at it is kind of with two caps. As I mentioned, one is as a marketing professor, and the other is as an entrepreneur. So yeah, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the first company that I had co-founded with Pete Fader was a company called Zodiac, pure MarTech software as a service firm. We programmatically ingested all the transactional and CRM data on behalf of companies. We specified these very accurate models for what each and every individual customer will do in the future, the probability that they'll come back, if they come back, the frequency that they'll come back, how much they're going to spend, the contribution profitability of that spend, work in customer acquisition costs, and that gets us lifetime value for every individual. And if you knew that, and you knew where those customers came from, or you knew the first product that they bought, or whether they came into a store versus online, or any other segmentation variable like that, which part of the country they reside in, then you could start to say, oh, here's where the heat is. You know, here are where my more valuable customers are coming from. Here are the products that those really high value customers tend to buy, or the things that those people tend to do. So that was really the focus of Zodiac. We grew it and sold it to Nike. And then we're able to carve into that non-compete that we could basically use the very same models, but use them on behalf of private equity firms for the most part. We also did some business with corporate, but it was really like the corporate development division of the company, where they were basically being a private equity investor. So for about 3 years, we did that. Now we're about 50-50 again, back investor versus corporation. So we've now run the models on at least 450 distinct companies across all their customers, computing lifetime value. So I've got a lot of confidence that the models that we're using, they really are very well validated. And as an academic, you know, we're here kind of writing these academic papers. Step number one is to show that the models validate well. And so we bring kind of an unprecedented level of transparency to how well we did. And if we didn't do a good job, we're going to go back in. But if you're working with a vendor, I would say that is one thing that I think you should be able to demand from them is, all right, you had a predictive model. Let's say that I chopped off the last 1 year of data, train your model on that, and now I'm going to show you what happened in the last year. How well did you predict it? And that could be a very good test of whether you should trust that model with today's data. So I figured I'd start just kind of laying out the framework for how I would think about the relationship between kind of customer purchasing and spending and valuation. I think that could be helpful for all those different audiences. And then bring it to life with a couple of examples. But I would say, you tell me, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on something that you won't find to be interesting. What I thought I would do just to kind of vary it up is first do a public company analysis. So one thing that we'll often do is we'll kind of stick our neck out. We'll take a company that's in the process of going public. We'll analyze all the data in their pre-IPO prospectus. And then we'll say, this is what we estimate as the fair value of the company. And anyone who does that knows it's kind of a stupid, the risk reward is terrible for doing that because basically, yeah, you could easily be wrong. And then you've made it's a very falsifiable prediction, Usually what the sell side will do is they'll kind of give themselves an out. But if you have a date and you have a price, there's no out. So we did this with a whole bunch of different companies by this point. I like to say that we've been right pretty much almost every time. One of them was Warby Parker. So how many people here have bought a pair of Warby Parker glasses before? Have. So I really like the company. They came out of Wharton. I got my PhD at Wharton. Pete Fader's from Wharton. So we're very big fans of Warby Parker, but they've kind of been an interesting example of the pendulum swinging in the one direction and then in the other direction. The second example is a relatively recent due diligence that we did on behalf of a private equity firm to kind of convey the sort of really cool insights that you can learn that might not have been that obvious if you were only looking at kind of like the traditional financials as a traditional kind of PE analyst would. So first example, outside in, we didn't speak with the people at Warby Parker. We just used the public disclosures. It's also a cautionary tale for disclosure. And so I think that can be really interesting. The second one, there we were in with all the granular data. So we could kind of tell a much richer story about what was going on. So if we want to focus, I would say this would be really relevant to everybody. Here, I think it still should be quite relevant, but if we wanted to kind of save some time, I think we could just kind of skip to number 2. So maybe, I don't know, you tell me, show of hands, do both? Cool. So what is lifetime value? And this actually speaks to what I was chiding the custom GPT about, because I've had dialogues with GPT about how they define lifetime value. In my class, I spent a full lecture on how it should be defined, because there's a lot of disagreement about how we should even define lifetime value. Should it be based on revenue? Should we include customer acquisition cost? Should we use variable profitability? What is variable profitability? What is CAC? These are all really fundamental questions, and they can really swing whether a company looks good or bad. So it really pays to have a good definition, or else you're just going to get the wrong answer. So I think of customer lifetime value as a very hard prediction problem. You have data on your customers up until today. You have to make a prediction of what they're going to do in the future. Each of the purchases that they make will have some variable profit associated with it after you take into account the cost of the goods, the labor, the shipping, credit card processing, expected returns. If the return rate's 5%, you want to make sure you're accounting for that. So after you kind of bake all that in, you have the stream of profits, and then you want to kind of account for the time value of money. You want to account for the cost of acquiring that customer in the first place, and that gives you, the actual value of a customer. So I've found, especially when you look to at least some of the pitch decks that I've seen, it gets really bad. You'll see these estimates of lifetime value, and they have a clear incentive to try and make the number as big as possible, because they want to report good numbers. And so it creates a conflict of interest that they're not really trying to get the actual true numbers. And I think it actually dilutes lifetime value as a metric and leads a lot of people to focus on other things like, gross profit payback period. And I'm a big fan of gross profit payback period and a lot of other metrics like that. I think that they're all very, very relevant and useful in their own way. But I think that ultimately lifetime value is the net present value of a customer. Anyone who has a finance background knows NPV is kind of like, it's like the gold standard metric for project finance. So we want to bring a lot more rigor to it. And that's really part of my mission in studying lifetime value for the better part of the past 10 years. So it's really this kind of multi-step prediction problem. We need to know how long are the customers going to have some positive probability of making a purchase? How long are they going to be retained? How frequently will they buy? How much will they spend when they buy? And then incorporate contribution profit. And then that allows us to be able to get lifetime value. And so the big question is, how well can we do this prediction? And the good thing is, there's been decades of research within the marketing science literature studying how we can do this really, really well. And so we're really kind of bringing the best of that to the market. So that's really, that is the objective here. And to the question about Apple, again, it's a very relevant question, especially on the CAC side, especially when we're looking to marginal CAC, where we're talking about the marginal productivity of acquisition dollars in a particular channel. That's a very hard problem. Apple's definitely made that harder. But in terms of being able to estimate the value of a customer's future purchase behavior, that has been relatively unaffected. It's gotten a lot easier to do that today versus, say, 20 years ago, because so much of purchasing happens either on your phone or through other digital channels, relative to, if you're at the grocery store and you didn't use your loyalty card or you paid in cash, it becomes very, very hard to be able to attribute transactions back to specific customer IDs. So again, we've written a whole bunch of papers. This is just a sample of the research in some of the top journals. And that's really what Zodiac did, was we would get the lifetime value estimates and then all the other quantities that you might be interested in. And we get that for every single customer. And we would end up with a distribution for lifetime value that ends up looking something like this. So this was kind of one of the key insights that we find time and again. The value of your customers is not normally distributed. It's extremely right skewed. Most of your customers suck. They mostly suck. At Lyft, 80% of the customers that Lyft acquires are unprofitable. They don't have enough variable profit to recoup their CAC. They make all their money on about the top 10% of the riders that they acquire. But they make so much money on that 10% that the cohort as a whole is fine. And actually their marketing return on investment is good. But it's good because they have this really small group of very high value customers. And what this implies is we really need to know, who are these people? How can we acquire more like them? How can we acquire fewer of them? Or maybe how can we lose less money on them? That's kind of one of the three.
Those are the cohorts when you acquire the customer. What's that graph?
This is just saying, let's get the value of every single customer and then look at a histogram of that.
Those are customer IDs on the bottom?
This is the distribution of customer lifetime value. Yeah, so it's saying this many customers are worth very little. This many customers are worth a whole heck of a lot. Yeah, so the x-axis here is customer value. I know that the font is really small. The y-axis is like the percent of the customer base.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and so what you can see is most of the customer base is here.
Are there some sectors or categories where companies are more likely to have a better customer lifetime?
Yeah, there's other industries where their first purchase profitable. They make money on the first transaction. There are some companies that are kind of gun shy and they don't really spend much on paid ads. And so, by construction, then assuming they're making money on on a variable basis on the products that they sell, then they will have strictly positive customer lifetime value for everybody, you know?
You look at something like Hims, which is like crazy gross margins, and they're spending a lot to grab market share. Like, are they really confident in their customer lifetime value? Is that one?
That's a big question.
Okay, yeah, but you haven't looked at that one, or?
Hims, I don't have good data. Well, I should say through credit card panel data, you could actually run a good analysis on them. At least you'd have a good read on kind of customer level revenue data. If we worked with Hims, then yeah, we would have access to everything, and then we could totally do that. But yeah, I'd say industries like mobile gaming spend a pretty good amount on CAC. They have very sophisticated customer acquisition departments. They make all their money on the top 0.5% of the downloads. So everyone else, they may not even make any purchase. Even then, yeah.
Yes, and you said that this report is from Nike.
Nike's the one who bought the company, so they had been a client. This chart was actually from a direct-to-consumer fitness retailer.
I see, and you said it like the graph is like for most companies like this.
It's mostly like this. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep, that's right. It's always right. It's always extremely right skewed. Yeah. Yeah.
It's always good when a client acquires a company. So, rough, if you have any anything here, like what is the sample size that you need to have, especially as you're a new company?
Yeah.
Where it starts to, I'm guessing there's some sort of like fall off of data where, yeah, is there any sample size you need?
Yeah. Most of the signal comes from the patterns across the customers. For most B2C businesses, we don't have to worry. It's, you know, as long as we have a good 1,000 customers, yeah, that will be fine.
Over like a year?
Yeah, like 1,000 customers in the cohort, I should say. Yeah. So if you have annual cohorts, 1,000 customers per year, yeah, I think that'd be enough. B2B, that's where you run into trouble. So we've seen a number of B2B SaaS businesses where they're getting 60% of the revenue from a single customer. And when that happens, then like you really need to know exactly what that one customer is going to do. And it's not that the framework isn't true for that. It's just then you'd be extremely uncertain, you know, because, you know, if they just decide to stop buying one day, then you're screwed. So we've actually, you know, we've had to turn down some business with B2B SaaS businesses that they just don't have enough customers. Another boundary condition is the number of years of data that you have. You know, so if you're a business that has a relatively, you know, longer inter-purchase cycle, like you're selling shower head filters or something like that, or mattresses, you know, suddenly you probably want at least probably 4 years worth of data to really. Hypothetically, yes.
I did, we have filters.
Yeah. Now, 4 years, I think the major ones should hopefully have at least that much, but there's a lot of signal in having some of those older cohorts. And then the idea is, even though the younger customers, the ones that you acquired more recently, you may not have all that much data from them, but you can kind of play this connect the dots game. You can say, well, they're kind of over or underperforming relative to the cohorts that have been around for longer. And so if you've got a good model, you can use that to make pretty accurate projections for the young ones too. But if you didn't have those cohorts that have been around for the 4 years, then you really are kind of flying blind. So I'd say that's the other big, if there's one other big, you know, type of company that we've had to turn down business with, it's that they just don't have enough years worth of data for us to be confident that we could actually predict well. So hopefully, you know, 4 years worth of cohorts, most businesses, you know, will kind of be at that point. Especially now it's important because, you know, we just had COVID. You know, if you go back 4 years, you're talking, you know, 2020. And so there's just all this disruption from COVID that you then need to kind of disentangle from the baseline. So it really helps to have at least 4 years. Yeah.
How come most of the customers have so little value to the company?
You know, 40 to 80% for most B2C businesses, between 40 and 80% of the customers are one and done. They made that first purchase, they tried it out, and they said, you know what, not for me. And so all those people, the company often paid CAC to acquire them. They made a single purchase and they ain't coming back. So if CAC is super low, then they still probably did okay on those customers. But then you have these other people, if it's a good business, that repeat buy all the time. And that's basically what creates the really polarized distribution. That you've got the people who buy a shower head for every single shower in the house and the summer home, and they're buying them all the time. You have the other people who tried it one time and they're like, what? I don't need this thing. So that's usually it.
Dan, if I interject for a second, we had one of our clients was recently acquired, and we helped with due diligence with the investment bank, and we saw 2% of the customer base drove 20% of the profitability. And so our question back to the team was, how do we recognize, see, maintain, keep eyes on these folks like daily, and what are we doing special loyalty and things like that, exclusivity? Because a couple tenths of a percent hammers the bottom line. More importantly, are we running ads on this, or can we use paid, neglect paid a little bit and go deeper in owned or direct mail leading with them as well? So
yeah, that's another point is you want to track not only how much you're spending per channel, like what is my CAC in these different channels, but also what is the value of the customers after acquisition in channels. Do I have a lot of the really best customers? Am I bringing them in through the paid channels, or are they coming in organically? And if all the best customers are coming in organically, then it's kind of a double whammy for the paid channels, that you're spending the CAC and you're getting a lower quality customer after acquisition. Like, you just want to know that, need not be true, but sometimes it could.
How do you do with the multiple touch points? Like, if someone isn't, when we first see it on like an ad, then they see another ad, where do you actually give the attribution?
Attribution is really hard. I'd say things get much more, much better after you've acquired the customer, after they made that first purchase. Personally, I've always struggled a bit with attribution because, one, the data is just not as good. It's just not as good. And, we all do the best that we can to improve data capture, but, there's still these massive gaps, and it's just getting worse with privacy regulations. So, and then there's the statistical question. Yes, my PhD is in statistics. So I'm a statistician by training. The problem with some of these models is, as soon as you start saying, well, we're acquiring customers through 6 different channels, and we can have these leads and these lags and these interactions, that all it makes sense to say, but how the hell do you identify that model, and have confidence in the predictions for each and every one of those different interaction terms? And then there's the whole issue of causality. It's just, so I think it's, you do the best job that you can, but you really want to have kind of a grain of salt, that it's just, it gets a lot shakier on that side of the house. So oftentimes we'll find that we'll use whatever model someone else is kind of using in-house. We can run MMMs like the best of them, but we'll just kind of use the standard model, and we'll just take the results with a grain of salt.
Dan, just 1 second. So there should be a mic now on everyone's table. If you could please use that for your questions so everyone can hear remotely. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, this is a space I'm kind of working in myself, so very, very interested in it. Just to double down on that point, I suppose, if we're looking at channel level CAC, but that's very, very hard to attribute correctly. When you're doing the valuations and the due diligence, are you doing like your LTV on a contribution basis or on a blended CAC basis?
Yeah, it's a good question. Now, if you're an investor, what you care is how much money this company is going to make.
I agree. Yeah.
So I think a lot of people, they get, causality and this and that. Well, ultimately, there's how many customers you acquire, there's how much money you spend. And if you can predict that reasonably well, then you're done as an investor. It's so much harder for the manager, right? Because they really do have to care about all the, the incrementality estimates.
Would you say most brands would be better off throwing attribution out the window and just going back to basics with it?
If you're an investor, I think that is going to be most directly relevant for the overall profitability of a firm, because that's actually, you can tie it directly back to overall profitability.
Paid media buyers in these brands are essentially investors on behalf of the brands. I just see too many brands getting caught up in the attribution conversation every day without understanding the overarching financial objectives of the paid marketing spend overall.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. I think I would do it both ways. Yeah, I do a lot of work with causal models as well, where you're actually trying to understand the causal effect of your marketing. So I very much appreciate the distinctions, but you always want to make sure then zoom it back out to the blended CAC calculations. That if, you know, you're feeling really, really good about, you know, incrementality, but then you're like, whoa, my CAC is still going up a lot. You still have a problem, you know? So, so at the very least, you really want to go back as a sanity check and just keep grounded in your average CAC calculation.
And my interject one thing too, we see a lot with agencies is if they're compensated as a percent of media spend, which is very, very common, has been for a long time in the advertising industry. So incentives get a little misaligned where we're going to focus on ROAS. Let's just focus on ROAS every day and hit a ROAS target. And then when you get into things like media mix modeling or doing some incrementality testing, it's like, well, I hit this ROAS target every day. And I think that's one thing we've seen a lot of times where, yeah, your things run away.
Same thing with the LTV, you know, going back to that clown picture at the beginning. A lot of companies, they tout these amazing LTVs and they're getting more and more unprofitable. Now, it could be that they're acquiring so many high value customers. They're paying all the CAC up front. They're going to make all this money later on. But sometimes after a while, you have to wonder, like, maybe the problem is that your model is bullshit.
How do you actually, when you're predicting lifetime value or CLV of the customer, how do you actually predict CAC movement? Because you can pick your direct consumer brand that says, we're going to keep growing like this and our CAC's $50. And then in 3 years, their CAC's 200 because they took the lowest hanging fruit with no competition. 50 people plowed into their market.
Yeah.
So how does your model actually predict CAC? Because to me, lifetime value, the lifetime revenue of the customer is actually the easier one to predict. Where the underneath is going to go is the one that no one seems to have a handle on.
Yeah, I think a first question would be, are you going to pursue kind of like the status quo marketing strategy? Or are you going to deviate from that and do something that's pretty different from what you've done in the past? Now, typically what we found is if you look at blended CAC, it tends to have a very well-behaved trajectory overall. And typically we found that you can actually—
Out of curiosity, at what scale are you starting this though?
At a pretty big scale.
Yeah, okay. So stuff that's already of fairly large revenue base?
Yes. The company's been around for a while, bringing in the customers, they're spending that marketing budget, and you just look at how much you're spending on the marketing relative to the number of customers that you acquire. So if you have a big deviation in your marketing strategy, where you suddenly are tripling your marketing budget, then you really don't want to look at the historical trends to project what your CAC might be. What I would probably do is I would run a sensitivity analysis where you say, I would expect diminishing marginal productivity in my marketing spend. And I'd probably run a handful of different scenarios for just how much diminishing marginal productivity might be and have that guide, you know, what my marketing spend should be, what the profitability of the firm might be. If they say to me, you know, blended CAC has been going like this, we're not going to really change our strategy very much, you know, my best guess would probably be to continue along that trajectory, because I found that historically tends to not be a terrible estimate. But if I have reason to believe that something big is going to change, then I absolutely would want to sensitize my model. So yeah, I personally, I'm a believer in, you have your best point estimate, and then you have sensitivity analysis to help, you know, judge whether my decisions should change. But yeah, predicting CAC, that's a tough one. Usually CAC is more retrospective, but you're right that, you know, really the big question right now is I have money that I'm going to spend. What will my CAC be? And then what will the profitability of that customer be after acquisition? So you do have to make some prediction of CAC too. So yes, the customer-based corporate valuation is basically a way of kind of formalizing that relationship between customer behavior and revenue and profitability. And the way that it does it, I'm going to explain it in a slide, but essentially, if you have a crystal ball and it tells you how many customers I'm going to acquire, how long they're going to stay, how many purchases they make, and how much they spend. It's an accounting identity that has to give us what revenue is going to be. So if we have these really good predictive models, then we can predict revenue more accurately, and we can get all of these other quantities that we're now seeing come up very frequently in company filings about unit economics, CLV, CLV to CAC, how all that varies by cohort, et cetera. So we've been at it for a while now. Got a handful of award-winning papers laying out the methodology, applying it a bunch of times. You know, we've gotten people like Aswath Damodaran on the bandwagon. Couple HBR articles on it. And we've had some analyses that have gotten the attention of pretty much everybody. We had a big, very controversial analysis of Wayfair that ended up being prescient, but certainly, yeah, got us in some pretty hot water with the executives of Wayfair. They didn't have very good LTV. It's the only academic paper that was cited in the seminal McKinsey valuation textbook. And anyone know Michael Mauboussin? Yeah, he's a big fan of customer-based corporate valuation. Good friend. So how does it work? The idea is that if you think about how much a firm is worth, most of it is typically coming from the value of the operating assets. And you can look to the effectiveness of the sales force, technology, IP, et cetera, and the claim that we'd make is every dollar of revenue is coming from a customer making a purchase. And so we have all this transactional data, we can do something with it. It can help us inform that estimate of the value of the operating assets. And I kind of talked through this framework just a second ago, but it's that idea that if you have good predictive models for acquisition, retention, ordering, and spend, it gives you revenue. That's basically it. It's really not that complicated. If you had a good estimate of contribution margin, blended CAC, and then overhead expense, and then kind of cash flow adjustments, you know, accounting for working capital and that sort of thing, that gets you free cash flow. So most of the value of this framework is getting an enlightened estimate of revenue and then understanding how it breaks down into kind of cohort level economics. Everything below revenue, you know, it doesn't really help as much. That's kind of like standard corporate valuation 101. So really the key is, can we establish a model that predicts acquisition well, retention, purchase frequency, and spend? That's the game. So it can give us good revenue predictions. The other thing it can do is it can give us these estimates of how much each of our cohorts are worth, acquisition cohorts, I should say. And the big things that we can get are, for one, how much am I making on my customers after acquisition? So this was from a diligence. You can see the blue bar is the value of customers after acquisition. The purple bar is how much they spent to acquire customers on a blended basis. And so the gap between these two, that is the CLV. And so we want to separately look, what are the trends in PAV, what we call post-acquisition value? What are the trends in CAC? And what does that mean for the implied return on investment? So we can see here, the implied return on investment in 2015 was 190%. In 2018, it was 138%, quite a bit less. Main reason why was the denominator got a little bigger. You know, they're spending a bit more on CAC, and the average value of customers after acquisition has gone from 112 to 100. So path to profitability, there's so many businesses right now, especially in the, you know, now it's in the Gen AI space, but, you know, before it was crypto, before that it was, you know, like meal kits. Growing really quickly, acquiring lots of customers, unprofitable. And the question is there a path to profitability? And what I would say is, there's a path to profitability if you have good current economics, you acquire a sufficient number of customers, and you don't have significant degradation of the economics for those future acquired cohorts. So if you have bad economics today, it becomes really hard to work your way out of that. For most B2C businesses, what happens to the value of customers over time, how valuable do you think the customers you acquire today are typically relative to the customers you acquired 2 years ago? Say it again.
Less value.
Typically less valuable. Typically, CAC moves up over time. Typically, the value of customers after acquisition moves down over time. And so we'll have all these cases where these businesses will say, well, yeah, maybe our economics right now, they're not that good. Network effects, you know, all about the network effects or whatever. I'm like, okay, you're a B2C business. You are selling something to people. Typically, it degrades over time. And so one of the reasons why people will often say, you want an LTV to CAC of 3-to-1 for a relatively young business, that implies a 200% rate of return, which sounds astoundingly high. One of the reasons you need it to be that high is because 4 years from now, it ain't going to be 200% anymore. And so you want to have sufficient buffer for that to shrink and you're still okay. If you're starting at 100% and you go down to 0, then you're in real big trouble.
Why does that happen?
A few reasons. The first is the customers that you acquire early on, they tend to be like the true believers. That's why they're like jumping in so early, you know, for them to adopt that early is telling you something. If it takes them a really long time before they jump on the bandwagon, it's just kind of indicating they might not have been that into you. The other thing is,
Aren't you assuming they knew you existed at that point?
awareness can be a blocker. Yep. But typically the true believers tend to be the ones that adopt early. And just statistically, again, you're right. In some sense, I don't know, you know, but across the many companies that we've analyzed, it is something that we have tended to see. The time that we don't see it is with truly networked businesses. Like if you have a marketplace or something like that, or Facebook, like social media, there you actually can see everything getting better over time. But if you have a business that really does not have very strong network effects, usually things tend to move in the wrong direction, but not always. You know, there are many exceptions to that. It just tends to be what we see on average. The other thing is on the CAC side, early on, more organic, more referral, you know, driven acquisitions, just cheaper acquisitions. It's usually later on, you raise that big round, now you're spending a whole bunch of money on paid ads. And then your blended CAC is going to be moving up. So you want to make sure your economics are better early on if you're not a business with super duper network effects.
I was told to use the mic here. Sorry.
Yeah.
All right. So this may be a silly question, but have you ever, these are your models that you're using to come up with these calculations like this? This
Yes.
is like, right. So have you ever done anything which would include not just looking at it from a cash flow or sales basis, but what the customer might be worth to an acquirer, like to a third party, if you were to build
That's
a business?
a good question. Not as much, but I'd say I've done some research into customer overlap, like share of wallet type analysis. And if you're acquiring a company that has customers that are also shopping with you, that might be, you know, a different sort of upside potential than if you had completely non-overlapping customer bases. But I think that's an interesting area that I wish I've done more. You know, we haven't done that. Usually we kind of value them on a going concern basis. Yeah.
Just in terms of what you're including in CAC, you know, one of the biggest levers brands have today is creative. Creative is not cheap. Are you including creative costs as part of your customer acquisition cost?
Yes. And that's one point I would strongly emphasize. This speaks to the, you know, getting the LTV calculation correct. What a lot of companies will do is they'll omit certain marketing expenses to be able to report a lower CAC. And it will make CAC lower, but those expenses are still there, you know? So I tend to be kind of a hard ass with my CAC estimate, you know, so I'll tend to put in not just ad spend, but, you know, the cost of the creatives, the cost of the salaries, certainly stock-based compensation. I would put that in. It's a form of compensation for those people. So So I tend to err on the side of putting in the marketing expenses if they are legitimately driving acquisition.
If I interject one thing though, I think to build on what Dan's saying, cost of creative, what we're seeing with Gen AI. I mean, I was shocked for my students. I gave them a massive data set of Facebook ads, carousels, all the way as granular as you could get. I said, now go create an ad. Some of them had the alien look with 7 fingers. But a bunch of them out of 70 students, I bet 10 of them you could run on Instagram out of the box using Adobe Firefly. So I think we'll see a massive shift, but you have to have that really good customer data to build the prompts and teach them how to prompt off that. But I think it presents a huge opportunity, especially with video, which can be so expensive to produce.
Yeah, so I'd say, I found that a lot of companies, it's as if there's a report card and they need to know unit economics. So they're getting an A or a C and they're just flying blind. Like they just really don't know. And a lot of the revenue is coming from these recently acquired customers. And they just have no idea, are these customers good? Are they bad? You need to know. It's really important. It's extremely important. So that's really that's what we're here for. I'm going to probably skip this because I don't want to drag on too long, but there's the question of what model do you specify? If people want to talk about that, love to. Otherwise, I can just kind of skip ahead to Warby Parker. The TLDR is it a subscription business? Is it a non-subscription business or a hybrid? And you probably want to specify a slightly different model for the one versus the other versus the third. And then the other question is what is the richness of the data that you have? If you have dumb data, aggregated, it's got holes, then you have to specify a simpler model because you don't have the data to support a rich model. You can say, I want to capture all these dynamics, but if your data is not rich enough, then you can't, what they call, identify that model. So it won't do you any good. Warby Parker. So again, we did our analysis at the time of the IPO before they priced. And for those who are familiar with them, they did actually a direct public offering. So there wasn't even like an actual IPO price. They just started to trade. And so we really had no idea when we were coming up with our fair value estimate, like what the heck, we had no reference point. We just kind of said, this is how much we think that they're worth. Now, thankfully, they disclosed a whole bunch of really good data. This tends to be a trend that if you're not super profitable, and actually at the time that they were going public, they weren't even growing very quickly, for those who remember. Now, they were hit by COVID, and they had like 60% of the revenue coming from stores before COVID. So, I think it was understandable that growth was not that strong. But usually then they try to compensate, companies try to compensate for that by showing how good the unit economics are. But it also then leads to some problems where they'll kind of take liberties with certain disclosures. So for one, they had this chart of cumulative customer acquisitions. And we look at a chart like this and we say, yes, I need to know this if I want CAC, because this gives us customers acquired. It gives us our denominator. But then you look at this chart, you say, there's something wrong with this chart. Does anyone see something wrong with this chart? One thing that's kind of weird, 2013 shows up twice. This was in their SEC filing. Last I checked, 2013 happened one time. Other thing, we talked about the slowing growth, right? COVID. Look at this. Whew. Perfect, parabolic growth. No slowdown whatsoever for COVID. So we took a closer look.
Would you expect a brand like this to slow down during COVID?
It did. And in fact, they showed it in some of their revenue figures. So maybe the claim could be acquisitions were unaffected, but revenue was affected. But I'm like,
Is that this in-store and online?
This is, total cumulative acquisitions in total. So, so we actually found not one, not two, but 5 problems with this chart. And then we found problems with their other disclosures. And so we raised the stink about it. posted about it, and it got a whole bunch of news, and they had to restate the filing. And there was a drop over there, and 2013 actually only happened one time, and all sorts of stuff like that. So that chart was wrong. This also speaks to another thing. If even a company like Warby Parker can totally F up their disclosures, just imagine all those Series A pitch decks. You really have to kind of take a very skeptical eye. And if anything kind of looks a little weird to you, ask for the underlying transaction data. Can't mess with that, typically, hopefully. So, but kudos to them. They restated the filing in like 3 days. They were very quick to they probably fired whoever it was, that banker. It's probably some junior banker at 2 a.m. They also defined CAC in a really bad way. So CAC, what CAC should be, is it should be how much did you spend on acquisition divided by how many customers did you acquire? Some definition like that. They had the right numerator, how much we spent on acquisition. They divided it by the total number of active customers. Not new customers, anybody. They could have been customers that were acquired 5 years ago. They included it in the denominator. What does that do? Makes the denominator big, brings CAC down. I'm not saying that's why they did it. Well, I'm going to say that. That's why they did it. So basically, if you were to make that adjustment, which we did, what you would find is that their actual CAC is much higher than was reported. So there's all sorts of stuff like that. Again, love the business, but they did not do very well in the disclosure department. We found that their economics were good. They had about a 3x LTV to CAC. And again, this was applying the pretty stringent, definitions that we tend to apply. We found that they tend to not get a whole lot of repeat purchases, as you would expect. They get their first purchase immediately by construction. They get the next purchase on average like 4 years later.
Why would you expect that?
Glasses. It's just inherently like mattresses. I think there's certain categories that just tend to be repeat bought with a higher frequency. And again, a lot of the average frequency is driven by, if you have diehard loyals, how many times are they buying? And so if you have like a food product, or if you have a clothing product, oftentimes you'll just buy tons and tons and tons of the clothes. But certain categories just inherently, there's like an upper bound on how much the loyalists are going to frequently buy.
Sorry, so if that was the CAC that was submitted for their S1 for the IPO, and they have very, very little repeat customers, but they were taking the total amount of marketing spend divided by total amount of customers, I mean, it's surely massively inflated.
Yeah, I mean, it went from it was big, but
Yeah.
It was like, they said it was 40 and it was actually like 56.
Pretty big difference for.
Yeah.
My God.
Yep.
But did they restate it or not, once you pointed this out?
This they did not restate, because
They probably said that because of our marketing, we're bringing back customers and they're coming in. That's why we count.
that would be true if the numerator wasn't just the acquisition related marketing. If the numerator was like all the marketing.
Yeah, but I'm sure what they were thinking is that, well, people may have seen the ads and they may not clicked on the ads, but reminded them to come back in order to be a customer.
Maybe.
My job.
In general, you're on much firmer ground if you say, here's my definition.
Oh, no, I'm with you.
Yeah, no, but
I'm telling you how I would
yeah. But yeah, to their defense, if you put the definition in the filing, then in some sense, I'm okay with that, because
Buyer beware, right?
yeah, then we can do the adjustment. Now, if the data itself is wrong, I can't do the adjustment. Yeah.
CAC's not gap. There's no gap.
No.
Gap for CAC.
Anyone familiar with the Netflix lawsuit over their churn rate? So Netflix used to disclose their churn rate, but they disclosed it in a certain way, because again, that's another thing, like, what is the churn rate? And it just so happens they disclosed it in a way that made the figure smaller. Surprise. And then there was this lawsuit that was filed against them, and the judge threw out the lawsuit because they said, look, Netflix, they disclosed the definition of the churn rate. And so if they disclosed it, you could undo it if you wanted to.
Sure.
So I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier the difference with subscription businesses and hybrids. And now that you mentioned Netflix, kind of brought that back for me. How does this change? I run a lot of subscription and hybrid businesses. So yeah, just curious how you
Makes
look
the
at
modeling easier because if it's a subscription, then you have a churn event.
Yeah.
Yeah. With businesses like Warby Parker, it's actually really tough because someone might not have bought in a year, but they're still going to come back like a year later, and so you don't observe churn. And so you need to basically infer churn from the purchase data, but you also need to infer the purchase frequency from the purchase data. And so yeah, it's just there's less that you get to observe, and that.
So you're going to measure, all the same reports that you've been talking about, if it's hybrid or subscription, and you're also going to look at the churn, basically.
Yeah.
Cool.
Same framework. It's just it tends to be easier. You tend to be much more accurate predicting for a subscription or a hybrid business. So LTV was good. This was an interesting example because the LTV was like 3-to-1. Having a 3-to-1 LTV to CAC does not mean that any valuation is justified. So I think we inferred a pretty healthy valuation, but we came in at around $22 a share. And then if we ran our sensitivity analysis on overhead expenses and WAC, we could get as high as 32. Where did they start trading at? It's like 54. So the emails came flooding in. You guys are stupid, you're ignoring the contact lenses. There's so much growth there. So there's all these articles that were written about the work. It was on Professor Galloway's podcast and Bloomberg, and everywhere.
Wait, did Scott dogging you?
Scott agreed with me. Yeah.
So when you say it was 54, they priced it, they did direct listing at 54 or traded up to 54?
It just, the thing about a direct listing is there's no one who's setting the price. It's just the market is trading it at that
Right,
level.
but they had to start the trading at a certain price.
Yeah, and that's where they started the trading.
At 54.
At 54. Yeah. So started at 54, and then not that long after, it just steadily moved down.
Did you a secondary in that period?
I don't believe so. Yeah, I don't believe so. So not only did they trade down to 22, so 22 is right about here. Then they started to trade down below 22. And then we started to take a look at them again because they traded down to 11. And at that point, it's like half of our fair valuation estimate. And we're like, yeah. So we revisited our analysis. Again, we posted it, very specific date, July 2022. And we said, we think that the pendulum has swung too far. We ended up with a valuation of $21 per share, basically the same as what we got before. And then you don't know, right? Now we're sticking our neck out again in the other direction. And there's upside potential. And so this is when we did our analysis, hung tight, and then it's come back up. Now it's 27. Now a lot's happened, right? We would want to redo the analysis because one thing that I would not want to claim is that a fair valuation will always stay the same. It will change. But yeah, I would say that I think the pendulum did swing a bit too far on that one.
Years.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to be right.
Yeah, and technically we said, again, we always do the sensitivity analysis because I really do think you never really know, right? Overhead could be a little higher, lower. We said even with our most pessimistic assumptions, we could get no lower than about 17. And actually it traded at 17 pretty fast. So that would have been probably when my scaredy cat, trading would have had me out of the stock. So yeah, that's when he says we're 22. That's when he says we're 21. So yeah, we had a nice, or by we I mean Pete Fader. He had a nice kind of recapping of the whole saga with Warby Parker about a week ago. 2 weeks ago, I guess. So that's Warby Parker. How we feeling? I don't know if we want to take a little break. I could just dive right into I could talk about this stuff for like 2 days in a row. So I actually think the next example is much cooler in terms of like tactical implications. October of 2024, and it's on behalf of a PE firm. This was a company that obviously we can't say what they did, but growing very quickly. And a big question was, again, for one, how good are the economics? A lot of the customers that they acquired very recently. And so if you're making an investment in a company like that, you really want to know then, well, how good are those more recently acquired customers? And then there was kind of a couple other big questions that they wanted to have answered about their ability to double down on certain channels. And so this is kind of a good example of being able to draw some conclusions about that through the transactional data. So this was a company, it hadn't been around for too long, about 10 years. They had about 500,000 unique customers over that time. This was an analysis of the direct-to-consumer business. Most of the business was direct-to-consumer, but they did have some other wholesale business that, again, that's kind of one of the gaps. If you're a business that sells direct to the consumer, but then you have some business that is through stores, typically it's really hard to link those two together. Usually, if you want to have good visibility into activity through wholesale channels, you're going to go to like a Nielsen or an IRI or some sort of data set like that. But then the ability to link that to the people who are buying online. I mean, if someone has a good source of data for that, I'd love to talk. But yeah, love to hear more about that. This is all going to be, again, lifetime value. It should be a profit measure. So here, we are kind of doing our best to get profit-based CLVs. One thing we didn't emphasize before is not only can you get the lifetime value of a customer, but you can also, another very relevant figure could be what is the finite horizon LTV? So how much value do we expect to derive over the next 3 years or 5 years? And sometimes that can be more conservative. Obviously, it's probably going to be a smaller number than the full lifetime value. But if you have a lot of value that's coming like year 10 and beyond, then sometimes it could be hard to, even just kind of bear that from a working capital perspective, from a cash flow perspective. Again, when we go back to SaaS, it becomes quite relevant because we did an analysis similar to the Warby Parker analysis on Slack, and we estimated that their payback period was 3 years. It took them 3 years on average to get their acquisition costs back. That's a really long time. But the customers, they monetize super duper well. So we estimated that, the marketing return on investment was like 1,000% for them. Really good. They were making money hand over fist, but most of the money was actually coming really far out in the future. Thankfully for, B2C type businesses, direct to consumer, if you're going out 5 years, 7 years, you're probably capturing most of the lifetime anyways. You're not having to make heroic assumptions about what's going to happen like super long in the future. So these figures will be 5-year figures. So I'll just kind of start with the analysis and then, we'll kind of see the main conclusions. This is a chart that's showing customers acquired year by year. And you can see, steady growth, but especially over the past few years, acquisitions have really been spiking, particularly in the past 1 year. And so then if we look to how much total value is being acquired, where we take into account not only the number of customers that we're acquiring, but also the value per customer, the total value that's being acquired is here. So very sharp increase in the recent periods. And I'd say this is typically a situation where this sort of analysis can be especially helpful because these customers are much harder to value, because you just don't have much data on them. And so you really need a good model to be able to back that out. If you acquired a whole bunch of customers 5 years ago and acquisitions are down, it's easier because most of the base, you acquired it a while ago and you typically have a much cleaner read. Like it's an easier thing to do to just kind of extrapolate them into the future. So this, I'd say, is the canonical situation where, the predictive CLV lens is going to be, it's going to be valuable.
Did the company that was selling here knew to do that to sort of gray out the numbers a little bit on the buyer?
Oh, they gave the transaction log. Yeah, we just did, I did a webinar with, one.
I mean, they knew that those 90,000 customers they were acquiring, they could attribute back to the lifetime value of their historical customers, and so.
Oh, yeah.
They could force the buyer to make an assumption if that was the case.
Yeah, that's something that you have to watch out for. We would always, because we're the first to say, you can't have this degradation in value or just change in value across cohorts. So we don't want to assume that their value is going to be the same as these guys over here. Especially if you see like a really big change in the composition of the marketing budget, because then it's like those could be pretty different people.
Set yourself up for sale.
Yeah. So this is another really kind of nice, just historical looking view of the composition of the customer base. What it's saying is at different points in time, what is the time of the last purchase of the customers that we have? So for example, if we look to the most recent time point, by that point, the company had over 500,000 customers who had bought at some point in the past. But if you look at it, about 150,000 of them had bought within the last 12 months. And you can see these customers over here, this is the total number of customers that have bought within the last 3 months. So it's to be expected. A lot of people who buy earlier on, they churn. And so these great people oftentimes are the churners. But the good thing in this case was the business had pretty decent retention. So this is another just helpful backward-looking view. Again, it can be helpful to have a combination of predictive metrics, but then also just historical metrics. The nice thing about historical metrics is they're auditable. And so if you just give me a transaction log, I can just compute this without any uncertainty stemming from the model. So you can see, actually back in 2014, they had a whole bunch of business coming from repeat customers. 2024, they had actually about 70% of their revenue coming from new customers. And that's because they've been growing very quickly. Usually this can be concerning if it's because customers are not repeating. So there's kind of two ways that you can have a small percent coming from repeaters. Either they're not the existing customers are not repeating, or you're just acquiring tons of customers. And thankfully, this was kind of more that latter story. So again, I said the value of a customer is the value of a customer after acquisition minus the CAC. The green here is the value of the customer after acquisition. This is the value of a customer after we account for CAC. So you can see their CAC in the most recent 12 months was about $4. Their blended CAC was really small. So you can kind of guess what one of our conclusions ended up being. The other thing you can see is the value of these customers is pretty good. And it's pretty stable. I just finished talking your ear off about how you often will see degradation. This is a business that sells the product. There's no real network effects here. PAV is flat. In some sense, I think flat PAV for a business like this, that is success. Not to sound defeatist, but it's actually pretty good. One of the big reasons why PAV has remained flat is because average order value has been moving up. It peaked in like 2021. It's come down since then, but in general, the trend has been up. A big question then is that price increase coming from people spending more when they buy, or is it from price increases? And so it can be very helpful to disentangle those two, because If it's just you throwing a whole bunch of price increases at the customer, usually that's not quite as good for repeat business. Here, it was driven by price increases, but thankfully we haven't seen that manifest in lower retention. But that is one thing that you just want to watch for if that's the main reason that AOV has been moving up. The better reason for AOV, the more benign reason for AOV to moving up is you have a whole bunch of people graduating into more expensive products, that the prices aren't changing, they're just buying the premium stuff. That wasn't the case here. This was a chart of their CAC. So their CAC had been about $4 or $5. Pre-COVID, it moved up to about 20. 20 is still pretty low in general. COVID knocked that down, went down to 6, but then it stayed around 6. So yeah, so CAC was really quite low relative to the companies that we've analyzed. Usually the direct-to-consumer businesses that we do diligence on, the CACs can be somewhere between at least like $25. It depends on the business. If it's a subscription business, usually the CACs can go as high as like $100, $150, depending on how premium the product is. So the PAV to CAC ratio, this is again like LTV to CAC, 3 to 1. I was just saying how 3 to 1. I actually think 3 to 1 is a pretty reasonable yardstick for a B2C business if you calculate it in the right way. Here, PAV to CAC is like 22. It's really good. Now, somewhat artificial, right? Because it's 22, but the CAC is $4. If the CAC was 0, their LTV to CAC would be infinity. But it's not as good as it sounds. So, that notwithstanding, very good ratio. I think they have the opportunity to invest a bit more aggressively on acquisition. Payback period was immediate. They got their money back on the first purchase. Very nice position to be in. Increasingly hard to do that. For those who operate businesses, it's just the cost of digital ads has been moving up. But again, part of the reason here is your CAC's $4. So they don't have to go up very far. But you can see on the very first purchase, they're up to contribution profit of like $40. So even there on the first purchase, they could still probably be more aggressive and still be first purchase profitable. They got to spend more money on CAC, I think. Here it is again, right? You'll just keep seeing it time and time again. If you look at the distribution of the value of customers, always super right skewed. This would go off really far if we did not truncate the graph and create this little slug of customers that basically represents everyone worth like more than $350. These are the people that the company is making most of their money on. You can see here, top 20% of the customers account for about 74% of the value. Everyone else, that means the bottom 80% represents 26% of the value. That's why customer centricity can be helpful in situations like this, because there's these big differences between your best and your worst. And so it can be very valuable to find ways to reallocate towards the best customers. About 15% of the customers are unprofitable, that the money that they make on that first purchase is less than CAC. So on average, their first purchase profitable, but not every single customer is. These people aren't. But 15% relative to our benchmark database is a very small percentage. That's doing quite well. Again, Lyft, it's like 80%. One thing that can be very helpful to keep track of is not only just AOV, but deaggregate it into what is the AOV of the first purchases that you're getting and of the repeat purchases that you're getting. And it really can go in both directions. Sometimes customers will buy on discount for the first purchase, but then they tend to buy at list price on the repeats. There you'd expect AOV to be higher. But then sometimes you have a company that has a hero product that's very expensive, and then all the repeat purchases are the accessories, you know, so you sell the baby stroller, and that's like $250, $300, but then all the repeat purchases are like the cup holder, you know? So you do not want to assume an average AOV and project that forward for the future purchases within cohort, because it just can be really, really off. So here we can see the repeat purchases are much higher than the initial purchases. And I believe that's because of discounting on the first purchase. Significant sampling, that people will buy these samples at a much lower price. And if they like it, then for the repeats, they're buying something that's almost twice as expensive. Here you can see, again,
You're giving a discount, are you putting that in your CAC then, or are you just looking at it from the AOV?
it's a good question. So it goes back to, what is CAC? CAC is something that's uniquely, it hits when you acquire a customer. If existing customers also, you know, can get the discount and do get the discount, then there's nothing that's really special about the discount to acquisition. So I would not put that into acquisition. Now, if it was a discount that's only going to new customers, then I would put it in CAC. So I'll often say, for me, the expenses that should go into CAC are the expenses that are caused by acquisition or cause acquisition to occur. So by that token, I would also put onboarding expenses and the customer success expenses that you tend to, you know, to incur, especially at the very beginning of a customer's life. I would put that in acquisition costs too, because it only hits when a customer is acquired. It just so happens that the direction of the causality is in the other direction. You know that you'll have to be on the hook for that money if you acquire the customer. Here you can see, so basically they've got their products that sell at list, and then they have the samples. And the samples, those are the things that are cheaper. Historically, about 2/3 of their sales are through samples. That's what drags down AOV. And in particular, that's what's dragging down the new AOV. But it's interesting that the percent of sales that are samples has not really changed very much since 2014. So again, we're learning a lot about this business that really would not have been that obvious if we just looked at like the income statement. And that's what I love about this sort of a thing is you start to tell a story about this business, like you really understand them on a much deeper level. So one thing that we did for them was do this analysis of, you get the sample on your first purchase, how many of them convert to buying a full-size product within 12 months? And
purchased samples or those freebie samples?
Those are purchased samples. Yeah, so they are spending money. It's just a lower. That's why over here, it's still like $33. Now this is a mix of products as well, but the samples are not all the way down to 0. So within a 6-month window, you can see about 12% of people are coming back and buying the full price thing. Within 12 months, that's it's just a bit higher. You can see the line has been kind of moving up over time. That's a good sign. So, one thing that can be very helpful with any business that has kind of something that entices people in at the lower prices, what is the trial to repeat curve? That you kind of have people, they've tried the freebie or the thing that's at the discount price, and then you kind of look at this curve where it's like, what is the proportion of the people who did that who then go into the full price thing? And it's going to asymptote at some point. Here you could look at the curve. We just kind of simplified it to show within 6 months, within 12.
You ever account for people that are using the first purchase discount multiple times?
Yes. Now it goes a little bit back to the nature of the discount. Like, is that something that someone who is not a new customer can do? Here, I don't remember if there are any constraints on the ability of somebody to, to just keep going back to the samples over and over and over again. So very helpful data, constructive, right? This trend is moving in the right direction. It's a sign of product market fit that the proportion of people that kind of convert from trial to full price is a decent, and the proportion's been increasing over time. The proportion of customers making a repeat purchase within some pre-specified number of days. Very nice, purely historical way of assessing how a company's doing. And here you can see it's been quite stable. So the proportion of repeaters is holding up well. The proportion of customers that are active always tends to look like this. If you're acquired, that means you bought, right? Means you had to have been active. So 100% of people are active in the first year that the first year of their life cycle. But then it typically falls off pretty quick. By the end of year one, about 25%, a little under 25% of the cohort is still active, and it's kind of asymptoting to some lower number like 10%. So this is saying you take all the people who bought 3 years ago, about 10% of them are still buying today. That's okay. That wasn't great relative to the other companies that we've analyzed, but it wasn't bad. So I think that's one other thing is there could be questions about like, what is a good number, And I think it can be very helpful to just have a benchmarking database, that you can kind of compare these numbers to. Another really helpful view. You acquire a bunch of customers, you look out over their life. What is the cumulative number of transactions per customer over time? So at the very start, you got the people who bought one, maybe some people when they first acquired, they bought a couple products. You can see at the very beginning of their life, they bought about 1.2, 1.1 products. You can see by 5 years later, just a bit above 2 on average. So the average customer buys a second time after about 3 years. That's kind of like Warby Parker. Warby Parker was about after 4 years. It's okay. This is cumulative value. So this is how much revenue we're getting. Now, again, initial purchases tend to be those samples, and then they tend to graduate into the products. The repeat purchases tend to be a lot more valuable. So you can see on average, they're getting about $45 at the very beginning of their life. Roll forward the clock about 3 years, they're getting about $80. Very instructive. And you really want to look at these curves across, these are all different acquisition cohorts. And one thing you really want to pay attention to is, are the curves bending down? Are they bending up? Are we making more money kind of at this point in the life cycle for these customers? And you can see the last 12 months cohort was, well, let's look at 2023. 2023 was this line right here, kind of right in the middle of the fairway.
How would the curve go down if it's cute?
Oh, the curve won't go down. Yeah, the curve at worst will go flat, but across the acquisition cohorts, yeah. So what I wouldn't want to see is I wouldn't want to see that the 2023 cohort is like this, like below all of the other lines.
This is still on a $4 CAC.
This is still on a $4 CAC.
So they're making money.
Yeah.
A lot.
They're making a whole bunch. Yeah. I think they might, the PE firm went ahead with a bit, but again, it's also a question of valuation. Good economics does not mean good valuation. Let me just see what else is really helpful here. One thing that can be instructive is to look at what is the average value of customers after acquisition as a function of the number of times that they've bought historically. One-timers worth about $40 on average. If they bought twice historically, they're worth about $100. If they bought 3 or more times, they're worth about $400. So really, really big differences. Again, this is why you want to find out what it is that makes these people tick. You know, can we find ways to acquire more like them? The value segments is where I thought there was a lot of insight from this analysis. So the people who bought samples, they were worth a lot less than the people who bought samples and products. Now, part of this is by construction, right? Because if you're someone who only bought samples, you could have bought once. If you bought samples and products, typically that means you had to have bought twice. So some of that is going to be tautological. But you can see even the people who have only bought a sample, they're still worth, you know, $60. CAC of 4, you know, they're still making a good amount of money. So the average value of customers after acquisition was 100. These groups, they're much more profitable, but even the group that's not as profitable, they're still doing quite well. And so one of the questions that we were asked when we were doing this analysis is, should we be more aggressive with the samples? And I would say yes. They have room to acquire more customers, and even if the economics were to degrade, CAC was to go up a little bit, you know, PAV was to go down a little bit, they're still coming out pretty well. So yes, I would say, you know, this would kind of support a more aggressive strategy for sampling. Because I believe that was the main way that they were acquiring customers, is through samples. This is just a breakdown of the percent of total post-acquisition value. About 46% of the total post-acquisition value that this company was getting was from customers who only bought products. About 40% of the value was coming from people who only bought samples. So even though individually they're not worth very much, there are so many people who are only buying samples that collectively they're worth a heck of a lot. It's kind of one other meta point. You have customers that may not be worth very much individually, but oftentimes there are just so many of them that you really do need to care about them too. So that's one thing I also want to emphasize. Like CLV, it doesn't mean that you should only emphasize the high value customers. If you have other groups where you're making a lot of money, you want to care about where the value is coming from. And so you need to take into account quantity and quality. So we kind of saw this before. People who only buy samples, very stable proportion of total orders, about 68%. And it really hasn't changed over the years. We then started to kind of slice it in a whole bunch of different ways. Like, what's the value of the people who bought a product and then bought a sample? How about the people who bought a sample and then a product? The people who bought both at the very start of their life, the people only bought products, the people only bought samples. So you can start to kind of break them out and see, well, you know, maybe if we try to provide them incentive to cross-sell. Now, oftentimes, people will want to see these sorts of cuts because they want to know like the upside opportunity from incentivizing cross-selling. And so if you get people to do two things, how much more will they be worth? And the idea then is you can say, well, if I know that someone who only buys products is worth 131, someone who buys products and then a sample is worth 500, maybe I've got some room to cross-sell them and incentivize them to make a purchase of the other thing. But you want to know how much expansion of value would you get from that. So let's see what else would be interesting. This doesn't really mean as much because the segments we had to obfuscate just to anonymize the company. But yeah, product first customers, they're more valuable on a PAV basis, but they aren't as valuable as customers who bought tons of samples. So this was a distribution of the number of samples that people bought on their first purchase. So there's a bunch of people that didn't buy a sample. And then you can see there's people on their very first order who are buying 14 samples. They're just loading up the truck on samples.
So is this a product where there's a core hair product?
This is a beauty product. It's like a cosmetic, yeah, it's like something like a cream, that sort of a thing. So these people are probably just buying up tons of samples and then they're just gonna use all the samples.
Trying to work out buying a product first and then samples after. Samples of other SKUs.
Yeah, it's a good question of what would incentivize someone to start with a product and then downshift to a sample.
We have a client like that. It's a hero product and they brought out new flavors and they sold it in turn of the samples of the flavors.
Yeah,
But it was mainly new customer acquisition driven by
the product.
people buying the core hero product without a sample.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that would make sense. Yeah, here I think they could be, because they had a whole bunch of different SKUs, they could also be giving samples to people for other products that they sell to try and get them to, to buy those products more. Yeah. So what I would recommend for a business like that is to look at how post-acquisition value is different for people who come in through different products. We found that product of first purchase tends to be one of the most informative variables when you're thinking about like identifying the best versus the worst. Usually demographics are not helpful. They're not that valuable. But the behavioral variables like product, those definitely are. So honestly, I don't want to dwell any further on this. I'd say, hopefully the main kind of key takeaways have, you've kind of seen them already. The big first one was you could see lots of customers were acquired, but all the data points that we looked at implied really stable value. There was no real sign of any degradation. And so even though they were acquiring tons of customers, makes you really worried. You wanted to look at it in many different ways. No matter how we cut it, the value of those customers was remaining stable. They were not underperforming. So conclusion one, if you're an investor, no like red flags to worry about. The big conclusion number two, I think they were less aggressive than they could be. And so again, if you think about post-acquisition value creation, well, you could value the business based on the status quo, where they kind of like aren't spending anything on marketing. But you could also say, well, maybe there's upside to the valuation because I know that this company is leaving money on the table, that they could be spending more and that we would make more if we came in and we just had them do that, So really the fact that you could see that these sample only customers have good value and that the value of those sample only customers, that has also not been degrading. That was a very critical, I think, piece of insight. So everything else, yeah, a lot of good stuff there, but yeah, I think those were kind of the two big ones. So I will leave it at that. Yeah, maybe question.
Just to almost even bring it full circle to the GPT that we looked at it at the beginning. E-commerce is pretty unique as an industry in that it's so data rich, but that's not always a good thing because it's hard to know what do you look at and what actions to take. At the end of the day, like with so much data here, a lot of it's econometrics, a lot of it's trends, that information can go over a lot of people's heads. Do you feel like we're far away from an environment where, the GPT ingests literally all of this econometrics data and tells you exactly what to do and get to a position where an agent essentially in time will start reducing OpEx at e-commerce businesses and agencies?
It's a good question. Where GPT is on firmest ground is with a summarization type of task, or here is objective data and I'm going to give it back to you. You may have said it a little differently, but I think this is what you were going for. The more you ask it to lean on like deep like analytics or some econometric model, that's when it can start to, then you really need a human in the loop, because then it can really kind of go off the rails. So I'd say with the sort of modeling that we do here, you could probably train a model to, to kind of run this sort of a thing, but it would need to be running the right model.
Human in the loop is fortunately improving a lot of businesses at the moment as well. It's all the data there, people aren't able to interpret it correctly. You could be running businesses incorrectly, and then what the data could be there to run it better as well. So I agree with you that the hallucination part of it is probably heuristic at the moment. But I can see that changing over time.
I think there's a lot of value to be had where you could kind of bring in other metadata that's kind of gleaned through GPT, because then it's kind of playing back into the strong suit. And you think about all these really valuable ways of kind of creating customer segments. There's lots that you can do with that. And now I think GPT, it just gives you so much more ability to create these interesting customer segments. And that, I think, you can worry a little bit less about like looking over your shoulder, you know, is this thing just giving me garbage results?
So if we fed all this data into GPT, it tells what company it is.
It probably does not have enough to go off of. Yeah, especially because we didn't give like even the category in this presentation.
How many customers?
Oh, well, that's, you know, where it goes back to Jake's point about the, you know, you're a data company. This would all be, you know, private, like, yeah, no one is sharing this sort of stuff. So, so if you had the credit card panel data and you had the ability to kind of like snoop through that and find companies that had similar curves in the credit card data to this company, that might be, you know, but yeah, their data is not, you know, publicly available. Yeah.
And what happened to the company? Did they get acquired?
You know, it's a good question. We need to follow up about that. Okay. Yeah, because I would say, again, price is what you pay, value is what you get. So here, basically, our conclusions were the economics are stable. They can be more aggressive. But I don't know what the management team was saying. You know, we won't accept a valuation below X. So I do know that the private equity firm was much more comfortable with, you know, kind of moving ahead. Usually what happens is the PE firm will have some traditional model that they use to value a company. And they'll often then look to something like this to say, you know, does this company have like skeletons in the closet that we really need to worry about? And then kind of secondarily, could there be upside that we're not really, you know, giving proper credit to? So usually that kind of core traditional valuation model that they use, you know, we won't affect that. But that will often kind of, the difference between that and whatever the management team of the company, that's where the magic happens. All right. Well, I will hand the mic over to over to Jake.
Dan. In the interest of time, we're going to fast forward a little bit for some of the questions on the board. Everybody's seeing me. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so really quick to kind of build on what Dan was saying. I'm going to totally steal this really quick. So one thing that I use a lot is the customer transaction log that you all are playing with. This is what it looks like. So we've got first website visit, a customer ID, the call log if they called in customer support, field after review on the website, the time they came in from a search engine, Google ad, an email. This is all fake, synthetic, made up, right? But you kind of get the idea here, what you can do, a daily ad spend for a second purchase, all the way through, and it goes all the way into net promoter score. So there's all sorts of stuff here. And so there's some things that are missing by design that you can get it to hallucinate against. And I think as Dan pointed out earlier, just to remind everybody, it doesn't have margin data in here, right? So you don't really know, you know, ad spends and things like that, a first purchase, a second purchase. But by definition, the one and dones, you know, you'll see this here, like a lot of these customers were one purchase and never came back. So really quick, this is what I use to help my students remember this. You think about customers, there's kind of probability of being alive. And so we call them Batmans, vampires, and zombies. But these are the ones that like they purchase and then they're going to die and go off. So this is where AI can kind of help you run your campaigns, where you can say, you know, they're about to die. When they get down here, like they're gone. We're not going to get them. So like, let's not run any paid media or spend any efforts on that, or set up an automation in like email or SMS. We're like, hey, give them a discount, 40% off. Maybe they'll come back, but statistically, they're probably not coming back. The next one, I think, as Dan pointed out, we call them the Batmans, but you know, who are these ones over here? 2% drove 20% of the profit. How do you identify those and then reward their loyalty? And then you can start to figure out they bought this, they'll buy this, and they'll buy that. So identifying those is a really good way to kind of juice it. Can you speak to this one, Dan? Because I think this is, you hinted at it a little bit, but I think this is one of my favorite graphs. To think about CAC and some of these things real quick.
Yeah, so the reason we got in trouble with Wayfair management team is they didn't like the chart on the right over here. Yeah, we found, Wayfair, this was back in 2017. And we wrote this academic paper of laying out the framework for how you can value a business off the customer behavior for non-subscription businesses. And the first version of the paper, it used hypothetical data, actually. And the reviewers came back saying, you need to do this on like actual public companies. You're proposing something, it should work for real. So we kind of hemmed and hawed. First two companies we found were Overstock and Wayfair. And so there was no cherry picking about that. And no matter how we sliced the assumptions, we could not come up with a scenario where they were actually profitable when they acquired customers. So here you can see the CAC we had estimated was $69. And this is basically the stream of contribution profits that they get after acquisition. And if you just kind of net this against this, we just could not get a positive CLV. So if the CLV is negative, or if it's zero, then actually acquisition growth is destroying value. The more you grow, actually, the more value you are destroying. And so you can't really come up with a good valuation number for a stock that has this. So we ended up inferring this, fair valuation distribution that did not include the then current stock price. It was like Wayfair, but much worse. Sorry, like Warby Parker, but much worse. And so the day that we had posted the paper publicly, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Andrew Left from Citron Research. He's a famous short seller. He was like, "This is really good work," and the stock fell about 10% on the day, and wiped out about $1 billion worth of equity value from Wayfair. So we started getting all these phone calls from the sell side equity analysts, and and then apparently Niraj Shah, he's one of the heads over there. I went to Wharton. Pete Fader, he's a professor at Wharton, and there's this retailing center at Wharton, and so he has his like proxy guy, and apparently what Niraj said was, "Yeah, I was contemplating giving you guys like a chaired professorship. There's no way I'm going to do that anymore." But yeah, it was all basically because of this chart over here, and that's what drove it.
Yeah, I think back to telling stories for non-technical people with some of this data, I think this is one of the best charts to think about some of these ideas. The last one too, really quick, the zombies, as we saw at the start of the, you have these Black Friday, Cyber Monday spikes. I think about the retention curves, like the zombies have the ones where the curves are pretty bad there. So you'll see if you look at these like Black Friday, Cyber Monday, can be pretty bad on the retention curves. Okay, really quick, I'm gonna go through pretty quick and go through some stuff here. This is the idea if you like bought a Nest thermostat, something used in class, maybe you start with Google search on desktop, now you're on mobile, and then you saw an influencer ad and shopping, and you go through this whole messy journey. Turns out there's lots and lots of touch points. This is what we kind of call modern marketing these days. This isn't a perfect way, but this is one of the things that people ask about was attribution. So we have cross-device, so desktop and mobile. And then we have, they touched Amazon, they touched the site, they did lots of different things, which is impossible to measure. But this is the proxy. So we can take basically, again, not perfect, a lot of this is directional, but we can take day of the week, how many sessions, how much revenue was generated, total ad spend for Facebook, impressions. Now, I think as Dan was mentioning, when you take, Meta, Uncle Mark's words for this, or Sergey, or whoever from Google or Meta gives you this, you're hoping that impressions are right. Now, how do they count impressions? That might be for, half a second on scroll on mobile. Is that really an impression? You don't know. So as you bake these data sets on top of data, there's holes in basically shaky things on that. But if you've heard of media mix modeling or marketing mix modeling, this was something that was invented kind of in the late 60s to kind of think about how much should I spend on a billboard ad versus a newspaper versus TV. A lot of this, you couldn't really model it statistically or make, have the computing power perhaps as well. There's now tools that'll let us kind of get an approximation. So this is actual live data from a client doing a big business coming in around almost 100 million on Facebook and Google. What you see here is it starts to we look at our revenue contribution as we spend more money. So we're spending more money, and you see it kind of these dots are kind of like reaching an asymptote and spacing out, meaning we're spending almost 13,000 and we're making an extra maybe $2,000. Everybody follow me on that real quick? So this seems very logical that you would maybe dial this back. This was the hardest thing to get the team to try because they're focused on a ROAS target. We're making money. They will not do this. So again, just because the data science tells us some of the stuff, it doesn't mean people will do that. So we're seeing basically almost a $12,000 a day waste to Facebook. But we go down here and we say, but look at Google. Like that thing hasn't even started going. Let's go pull back and put that 12K over here and test it. No, sorry, we don't want to do it. This is another one. So we got a couple different, we have Facebook, Google, TikTok, and Criteo, a couple different platforms. We're seeing these stretch out. Excuse me. And so again, we might pull back on Google and maybe go hard at Facebook here and see. Again, really hard to get people to kind of change that. Bing a lot of times too is the dark horse that nobody will try. We built Caterpillar's workwear's D2C brand. They had a big Amazon business. We weren't sure we could pull stuff off Amazon. We started testing on Bing. It turns out Bing was like a gold mine for returns with ads because people that buy Caterpillar use Bing as their search engine. So the biggest thing is I kind of keep testing on all these types of things. Really quick with AI, only 35%, again, this paper just came out yesterday, are able to kind of shift these budgets across platforms and channels and using some AI to do that. So we're still pretty early, and only 20% are doing this in real time with AI-powered segmentation. So some of that customer data to build these segments, you can definitely be ahead of your peers on the value creation there. But at the end of the day, still attribution is messy. I still feel like we're kind of going back to half of marketing's wasted. We don't know which half, kind of this 125-year-old problem on that. But there's some directional clues. Okay, we're going to shift gear here. I figured in today, we want to be a little bit dragging. We're going to do kind of more of back to kind of a hands-on exercise here and play with the GPT. So I'm going to show you some examples. For those of you, for a framework, I did a talk for OpenAI in November using some of my students' work. And what I've noticed with, who here's done prompt fundamentals? Everybody done any on how to prompt stuff? Okay, some have, okay, perfect. Well, we'll go with this pretty quick. So this is what I notice when students use these stuff in class. Like, how do I market Nest thermostats, right? They treat it kind of like Google. What's the best way to sell thermostats online? Digital marketing for Nest. I'm going to show you an example of what's possible. So one of the cases we did for the students was you have to go to the art museum. None of the students go to the art museum. It's free. So part of their field trip assignment in class was go to the art museum and find a piece of art you like. And you have to think about how do you market a free art museum in Boston? And then how do you generate creative? So as some folks asked earlier, I think this afternoon, on what can be done with creative, I think this you start to see what's possible here as well. So they go to the art museum, find art, take a photo. We use Adobe Firefly. They had to record their prompts. This is Mimi. You can see how deep her prompt went. Create a classy and polished poster campaign. It goes on and on and on. And here's the next thing. She took that from Firefly to ChatGPT. So he's using 2 different LLMs to play with it. And that's what she came up with as well. So this is one of their most favorite pieces they have, or most popular, and then basically did that off of using these 2 things, which I think you could, is very good for running creative off of as well. If you have the actual brand standards or voice and tone of the customer, all that good stuff, you can also build that into a custom GPT and have it use that as an editor as well. Okay, so how do you do it? This is the biggest thing, and I'll show you some examples here. We call it Ratty. Define the role you want it to play. Give it an assignment, what you want it done or what you want to ignore. Give it a deliverable. And iterate. A lot of people don't iterate with this, which is a big one. And then the exclamation point, accessing some of these large language models, sometimes we don't know quite why, but if you tell it, pay attention, I can get fired if you're wrong. I mean, things like that will boot it up to pay attention and give you better examples. So this would be more of if I was to write an updated prompt for that using the Nest example, this is kind of what you might think about having it write out in that depth like that. So what I would say we should play with really quick is I pre-built some prompts here. and you have a bunch of different ones, but we'll go in and we'll start with the COO. Well, let's start with the digital marketer one. We'll start with this one. So we're going to go here and we'll go to this custom GPT. Let's see what it does. So again, it just has that customer data log, has some transaction log data. It's got customer reviews, some purchase data, NPS score, and then geographic data based on things like that.
Do you ever use GPT to help you create the prompt to use back into GPT?
I've used Claude with GPT to help write the prompts to get them going back and forth. What I do a lot too is for grading, I will go grade the best, and then I will basically blind grade off that too as well to see, which has been kind of fascinating too as well. So for those of you that have analysts in-house, that all this stuff can be kind of scraped and put into Google Colab, which is a way to kind of analyze big data sets, connect to Google Cloud or something like that, if you don't know Python. But it's basically writing all this here pretty quick for us, which is pretty interesting as well. I think this is like the coolest thing in the world, because you can basically start to unlock pretty sophisticated insights without having to know all this code. And when we do a lot of work with private equity, a lot of times they don't have the tools in-house because the data sets are so big. And so Excel will break and their in-house teams can't get to it. Yeah. Okay, so here we go. By the way, I didn't know what I was going to do. I just wrote these. So it's taking some random stuff here for timestamps. It could be hallucinating. I think one of the questions earlier, like, can you just throw all this in? I mean, eventually you're going to just get cogs and you throw it in an LLM and it builds everything and puts it on Amazon for you. Maybe in the future that could happen. I do think you still need to have, somebody watching the drunk intern, but it's building some sort of a correlation here between traffic and repeat purchases. So it's saying that there's some sort of a correlation coefficient between email, time on site, and repeat purchases versus SEO, and the worst is Bing ads off that data set. Now, I would go validate that and see, but this tends to directionally be pretty accurate what we see. People that come in from email tend to purchase more. And then it's going to tell us, okay, so it's going to give some clues here on what to do off of boosting that based on SEO, enhance that as well. Let's take another one. So this one, we're going to see, can it create an ad for us? So we're telling it use Dolly, and you can throw this into Firefly or other tools as well. So direct response digital marketer, graphic design skills for social ads. Review the comments and sentiments, and then build me something for Gen Z who are apprentice electricians. So there's some demographic data here as well. And we'll kind of see what it comes back with here. So it's going through the NPS comments and finding out what people say with high NPS. It's going to analyze those. And some of this should be like, yeah, this isn't that great. So you see it's coming back with beginner electrician looking overwhelmed, confident professional Gen Z electrician. We'll see what it does for ads. So we're seeing the kind of the typical cartoon look, right? I mean, this isn't, I mean, you can kind of see this all over LinkedIn and things like that. Like there's nothing like super fascinating. If you played with any image generation with Dolly, I mean, this is way better than it was like 12 months ago. So for writing briefs for a creative agency, I mean, you can kind of hit the ground running and say, okay, I want it to be this or this, make it look somewhere along those lines. Maybe not something you don't necessarily want to run, but if we sat here and iterated with these prompts, we could probably get something back that could be pretty testable at least. I think on Monday, there was a good example of crappy ads, the Post-it notes, and things like that. The more sketchy ads can actually perform much better. And that's about the only thing we can test anymore in paid campaigns and creative, right? It's so black box in the middle. So being able to huck and run lots of creative. The thing we've seen a lot of clients will struggle with is getting that creative done and any sort of like predictable, rhythm or testing it. I think Gen AI starts to unlock this in a way that can be pretty interesting and pretty cost effectively as well. Okay. Do we want to try running one and see if they can generate a really bad ad in a custom GPT? Does anybody have any good ones? We'll do it live here real quick. So we'll do the opposite. This is something too, someone acts as a lazy marketer and design me a horrible ad based on low NPS, and we'll see what it kind of does here as well on the other side. And again, really quick, all this is doing is, this is the raw file it's working from. So it's just, all it has is a raw CSV file, of this data set here. So nothing super exciting here or super interesting. It's pretty boring and basic on that side of it. So. Or don't, whatever.
On that CSV file, did you have to define what the columns in or figure it out?
The what was it?
What the header columns actually were speaking to in the data set, or they didn't figure it out?
They figured all that out.
They figured it all out.
Yeah, exactly.
Did it take any iteration on its side, or did that?
No.
just get that
You got it pretty good. Yeah. So, and I left this like, who here's built custom GPTs? Has everybody built custom GPTs before? Yeah. So I think these are like pretty amazing with what you can do with them out of the box. When I've uploaded like academic papers to it, my teaching notes, brand standards, financial reports, analyst reports, sometimes it'll hallucinate if you give it lots and lots of data. But it's the more that you can kind of teach off that or give it to learn from, it does a pretty darn good job figuring it out as well. The other thing is when you write that custom GPT, you tell it, don't do this. Don't pay attention to this or do that. I think give it some guardrails. That helps pretty well on that side of it. So.
What are the data points that it's using to generate the images?
I just told it, look at low NPS scores. If we had done a customer lifetime value calculation in the actual thing, you could say, look at low NPS, low CLV, or vice versa, and have it generate creative off of that too, to see. I don't think I have an example in here of this deck, but this same student, we're doing an independent project now. We're looking at prompts that first-year MBAs are putting into Harvard's GPT in the accounting class to see what they're using by time of day and device to analyze it. And she did, I mean, she was a total rock star, and she did an amazing job on her final exam with like took all this ad data and had ads you could totally run off of repeat purchases and lifetime value as well. So in the interest of time, this is kind of like a quick stack you might think about. So basically, Google Trends is great for keyword data directionally. I will grab screenshots of that and go into GPT and say, you know, tree trimmers, what's the regression line look like on that, right? You can download a CSV or just take a screenshot of it. Firefly is great for images and things like that to drive sessions. If you're running things on site, Google Analytics sucks now. I don't know if anybody works with GA4, but it's pretty bad. But Microsoft Clarity is free, and it'll basically show you heat maps, scroll depths, all sorts of good stuff on site for conversions. And like we just saw, Google Colab, Python, and Looker to visualize it. You can huck all this from the GPT. And then I like to play back and forth between these two. I didn't have time to put DeepSeek in here yet, but that'd be another one to play with too as well. Last piece, I think, big thing is like there's so much data everywhere, but customer interviews, competitor reviews, YouTube, social, going on and grabbing YouTube, translating it into text off competitors or influencers, and then running GPTs across that has been really helpful for us. Any of your customer interviews is really, really good. And then competitor reviews, assuming some of them are going to be fake, but those can be a gold mine too as well to find weaknesses in the products as well. Yeah, last piece, the catalog. I can't stress this enough. This is an example from Oboz. They're owned by Kathmandu Brands out of New Zealand. They're a client we work with for about 5 years now. These little things like men or women, size, do you need waterproofing, how wide is your foot? These build amazing customer segments at Capture, which is huge. So when you pair that with purchase behavior, we have another way to start to slice, repeat lifetime value and all that good stuff. And now we can kind of start to take the product catalog where maybe we have a lot of size 10 hiking boots. Who wears size 10 and hasn't bought in the last 2 years? We send a push alert over text instead of running an ad on that. And then we can drive purchases. So from doing that, we were able to get, you know, pretty good lift. We've done this across a lot of different brands. It doesn't always work, but when you do have the data and you can push it, you can really make things move in an attractive way as you build the data sets. To wrap up, okay, real quick. I think culture should adopt AI. More importantly, build the data sets, stand to gain here in this new world. I think as Dan has showed you, there's a gold mine in customer transactions. and you don't need a lot of it in terms of like the depth of it. You can do a lot. You saw it with our GPT. Attribution's messy. Catalog right product. If you have any feedback for us, that's a quick form you could fill out for us. That's our emails. If you have any questions and want to go a little bit deeper on anything here as well.
So I post about this stuff all the time on social media, so Twitter and LinkedIn. Love to connect there too.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.